Welcome to my channel Midnight Stories, where you find horror stories that scare you. Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. This happened in the 1990s, 1997 to be exact. I never thought much about solitude until I took the assignment at Denali National Park in Alaska back then. My name's Owen Mitchell, and I'd been a park ranger for a few years at that point. The vast expanse of wilderness up there is something that both humbles and exhilarates you. There's a kind of quiet that settles into your bones, a stillness that's hard to find anywhere else. I grew up in a small town in Maine, where the tallest thing around was the church steeple. The forests there were nothing compared to the endless stretches of pine and tundra in Denali. I moved to Alaska looking for a change of pace, maybe even a bit of adventure. On my days off, I'd hike trails that hadn't seen footprints in weeks, fishing rod in hand, hoping to catch dinner and a good story. The first few months were uneventful, filled with routine patrols, guiding the occasional tourist group, and getting to know my fellow rangers. There was a camaraderie among us, born from shared experiences and the isolation of our posting. We'd gather in the common room of the ranger station on cold nights, swapping stories over steaming mugs of coffee. It was during one of these nights that I first heard whispers of something strange in the park. Two of the more experienced rangers, Hank and Meredith, were talking in hushed tones by the fireplace. I caught snippets of their conversation: unexplained tracks, missing hikers, strange noises at night. When I approached to ask what they were discussing, they quickly changed the subject, laughing it off as nothing more than campfire tales. But the seed of curiosity had been planted. I started paying closer attention to the reports coming in, noting any unusual occurrences. Most were easily explained: a bear sighting here, a lost hiker there. But there were a few incidents that didn't quite add up. A seasoned backpacker who vanished without a trace, only to reappear weeks later with no memory of where he'd been. Unusual claw marks found on trees, too high and too deep to be from any known wildlife in the area. I didn't put much stock in these oddities at first. The wilderness has a way of playing tricks on the mind, especially for those not used to its vastness. But as winter approached and the days grew shorter, an unease began to settle over the park. One crisp morning in late October, I was assigned to check on some remote cabins used by researchers during the summer months. Winter was closing in fast, and we needed to make sure everything was secured before the heavy snows made the area inaccessible. My colleague, Diane Kowalski, was supposed to join me, but she'd called in sick with a nasty case of the flu. So I packed up my gear, loaded the snowmobile, and headed out alone. The ride out was smooth enough at first. The sky was a pale gray, the kind that makes you wonder if the sun ever truly rises here. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches weighed down by fresh snow. Occasionally I'd spot a hare darting across the white canvas or catch the distant call of a raven. As I traveled deeper into the park, the landscape began to change subtly. The trees seemed to grow closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to form dark tunnels. The silence deepened, broken only by the hum of my snowmobile. Even the wildlife seemed to have vanished, leaving behind an eerie stillness. After a couple of hours, I reached the first cabin. From the outside, everything seemed in order. The windows were locked, and there were no signs of forced entry. I dismounted and approached cautiously, my boots crunching in the fresh snow. Inside, the cabin was just as we'd left it at the end of summer. Dust motes danced in the pale light streaming through the windows. The supplies were untouched, neatly stacked on shelves along the back wall. I noted it all on my checklist and moved on to the next cabin, about 5 miles deeper into the woods. As I approached the second cabin, something felt off. Even from a distance, I could see that the door was ajar, swinging gently in the icy breeze. I parked the snowmobile and approached cautiously, my hand instinctively moving to the radio at my belt. "Hello? Anyone here?" I called out, half expecting a fellow ranger or maybe a lost hiker seeking shelter. There was no reply, just the soft creak of the door in the wind. Inside, the cabin was in disarray. Chairs were overturned, papers scattered across the floor, and a strange musky odor permeated the air. It smelled like damp earth mixed with something metallic, almost like blood. I pulled out my flashlight and swept the beam across the room, my heart rate quickening. That's when I saw them, claw marks etched deep into the wooden walls. 3 parallel lines, too wide for a bear and too deep for a wolverine. They ran from floor to ceiling in some places, as if whatever made them had been searching for a way out, or a way in. I radioed back to the station, my voice tight with tension. "This is Owen at Cabin 2. I've got signs of forced entry and possible animal activity. Over." Static was my only answer. I checked the device, tapped it a few times, but the signal was dead. "Great," I muttered. "Just great." Stepping back outside, I decided to inspect the perimeter. The snow around the cabin was disturbed, but not in any way I could easily read. The tracks were erratic, overlapping, and unlike any animal prints I'd seen before. They were large, almost oval, with what seemed like 4 toes ending in sharp indentations, claws maybe. But the stride was all wrong, too long for a quadruped, yet not quite human either. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Alaskan air. A joke came to mind about how I moved to the coldest place possible to avoid getting cold feet, but it fell flat even in my thoughts. Determined to finish my duty, I decided to head to the 3rd and final cabin, about 7 miles further into the backcountry. If something dangerous was out here, I needed to know. The safety of the park, and potentially the lives of future visitors, depended on it. With one last glance at the mysterious tracks, I mounted my snowmobile and set off. The unsettling image of those claw marks burned into my mind. The trail to the 3rd cabin was rougher, less maintained. Branches reached out like skeletal hands, scraping against my jacket as I pushed through. The trees seemed to press in closer, their shadows deepening despite the midday hour. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, my eyes constantly darting to the periphery of my vision. About halfway there, the snowmobile sputtered and came to a halt. I tried the ignition. Nothing. "Out of fuel," I muttered, mentally kicking myself for not checking the gauge before setting out. Should have checked the gauge, genius. I weighed my options. Turning back would mean trekking several miles on foot through increasingly unfamiliar territory, but pressing on to the next cabin would at least offer shelter and possibly a working radio. With a resigned sigh, I grabbed my backpack, tightened the straps, and moved forward on foot. The forest grew denser, the trees crowding together as if sharing secrets. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of my boots against the snow and my own labored breathing. The air felt thicker here, almost oppressive, and I found myself having to stop more frequently to catch my breath. Then, in the distance, I heard a sound. It was faint but distinct, a sort of chittering, like the murmurs of a crowd heard through a wall. I paused, straining to listen. The noise stopped abruptly, as if whatever was making it had suddenly become aware of my presence. Shrugging it off as the wind, I continued, but the sound picked up again, louder this time. It seemed to come from all around me, impossible to pinpoint a direction. It was disorienting, like being in a room with speakers hidden in every corner. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small amidst the towering pines. "Is someone out there?" No answer came, but the noise ceased once more. I felt uneasy, like I was the punchline in a joke I didn't understand. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. I picked up the pace, eager to reach the cabin before nightfall. As the light began to fade, casting long shadows across the snow, I finally saw the outline of the 3rd cabin. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The structure looked intact from a distance, but as I drew closer, I noticed details that set my nerves on edge. The windows were dark, covered from the inside with what looked like thick cloth. Smoke wafted gently from the chimney, but it had an acrid smell that made me wrinkle my nose. I approached cautiously, my hand once again going to my radio out of habit. "Anyone in there?" I called out. "This is Ranger Owen Mitchell." Silence was my only answer. I tried the handle. It turned easily, too easily for a cabin that should have been locked up for the season. Stepping inside, warmth greeted me, along with the comforting crackle of a fire. But the cabin appeared empty, devoid of the usual signs of human habitation. A pot of something aromatic simmered over the hearth, filling the air with a rich, meaty smell that made my stomach growl despite my unease. On the table sat a mug of steaming tea, wisps of vapor curling into the air as if it had just been poured. The whole scene was unsettling, like arriving late to a party where everyone had just stepped out. "Hello?" I called again, more cautiously this time. That's when I saw it. A notebook lying open on the desk, its pages filled with hurried handwriting. Curiosity got the better of me. I approached and began to read. Day 12. The creature is more intelligent than we thought. It watches, studies. Last night it mimicked Jacob's voice. We almost opened the door. I flipped back a page, my heart racing. Day 11. We've barricaded the doors and windows. Food supplies are low. The radio isn't working. Mariah is starting to panic. A cold knot formed in my stomach. This wasn't a research team studying wildlife. They were hiding from something. Something that was hunting them. I turned another page, the writing becoming more frantic. Day 13. If you're reading this, we didn't make it. The creature can imitate sounds, perhaps even voices. Do not trust anything you hear outside. Do not go into the woods at night. It's out there, waiting, learning. God help us all. Just then, a soft knock came at the door. I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. "Owen, is that you?" a woman's voice called out. It was Diane's voice, my colleague who was supposed to be sick back at the station over 30 miles away. My mind raced. There was no way she could be here. It was impossible. "Owen, please open the door. I need help." The voice was pleading, tinged with fear and desperation. I backed away, heart pounding so loudly I was sure it could be heard through the walls. The door rattled as the knocking grew more insistent. "Let me in. It's cold out here." I glanced around for a weapon, anything I could use to defend myself. Grabbing a heavy fireplace poker, I positioned myself near the back of the cabin, as far from the door as possible. The door handle twisted slowly. I watched in horror as it opened, revealing not Diane but something else entirely. It stood upright like a human but was covered in coarse, matted fur. Its face was elongated, resembling that of a hyena but with patches of bare skin stretched tight over protruding bones. Sharp teeth glinted as it pulled back cracked lips into a grotesque approximation of a smile. The creature was tall, easily 7 feet, with long arms that ended in wickedly curved claws. Its eyes were the most unsettling feature, large, unblinking, and filled with an intelligence that seemed almost human. It stepped inside, moving with an unnatural grace that belied its size. The floorboards didn't even creak under its weight. The creature tilted its head, eyes reflecting the firelight with a predatory gleam. It opened its mouth and Diane's voice came out, perfect in every detail. "Owen, it's me. Don't you recognize me?" A twisted sense of anger bubbled up inside me, overriding my fear for a moment. "That's not funny," I growled, gripping the poker tighter. The creature took another step forward, its movements fluid and purposeful. Without thinking, I swung the poker. It connected with a dull thud against the creature's arm. For a moment, everything was still. Then the creature let out a sound, a mix between a laugh and a snarl that sent a shiver down my spine. It lunged at me with incredible speed, and we both fell to the floor. Its claws tore at my jacket, narrowly missing flesh. The stench of its breath was overpowering, a foul mix of decay and damp earth that made me gag. I kicked upwards with all my strength, somehow managing to push it off me. Scrambling to my feet, I made a dash for the door. The creature was fast, but the cluttered cabin slowed it down just enough. I burst outside, the cold air hitting my lungs like a punch to the chest. I ran blindly into the woods, not daring to look back. Behind me, I could hear the creature giving chase, crashing through the underbrush with terrifying speed. The fading light made it difficult to see, but I didn't dare slow down. Branches whipped at my face, leaving stinging cuts across my cheeks. Ahead, I spotted a narrow ravine. Without time to think, I leaped across, barely making it to the other side. I heard the creature skid to a halt behind me, and for a moment there was silence. Then it began to mimic again. This time it was my own voice, calling out in panic, "Help! Somebody help me!" The effect was unnerving. Hearing my own pleas echoed back at me almost made me stop, but I pressed on, my legs burning with exertion. In the distance, moonlight illuminated the outline of an old maintenance shed we hadn't used in years. I made for it, praying it would offer some kind of refuge. I ducked inside, bolting the door behind me. The shed was small, filled with rusted tools and old equipment. I searched frantically for anything useful, my hands shaking as I rummaged through drawers and cabinets. In the corner, I found a flare gun with one shot left. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. A scratching sound came from the door, followed by a low growl. Then the creature spoke in another voice, one I hadn't heard in years, my father's. "Son, open up, it's okay, let me help you." My hands shook as I loaded the flare gun. "You're not real," I whispered, more to myself than to the thing outside. The door creaked as the creature began to force its way in. Wooden splinters flew as its claws tore through the aged wood like it was paper. As it squeezed through the gap, I raised the flare gun and fired. The bright light hit the creature square in the chest, igniting its fur. It let out a shriek unlike anything I'd ever heard, thrashing wildly as flames consumed it. Seizing the moment, I kicked open a loose plank on the side of the shed and slipped out. The creature was distracted, giving me a precious few minutes to put distance between us. I stumbled upon an old service trail and followed it, my lungs burning with each breath. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, I saw headlights in the distance. A park maintenance truck was idling, 2 rangers inside finishing up their rounds. Waving my arms, I shouted, "Hey, over here!" They saw me and pulled up, their eyes widening as they took in my disheveled appearance. "Owen, what the hell happened to you?" one of them, Mark, asked. "There's something out here," I gasped, clambering into the truck. "We need to get back to the station now." They didn't ask any more questions, sensing the urgency in my voice. As we drove away, I glanced back toward the tree line. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a pair of eyes reflecting in the darkness, but it could have been a trick of the light. Back at the station, I reported everything. My story was met with a mix of concern and skepticism. The senior rangers listened intently, their faces grave as I recounted my encounter. But I could see the doubt in their eyes, the unspoken questions about my mental state. "Owen," Chief Ranger Hodges said carefully, "you've been through a traumatic experience. Maybe it would be best if you took some time off." I shook my head vehemently. "You don't understand. There's something out there, something dangerous. We need to warn people. Close off that section of the park." Hodges exchanged a look with his deputy. "We'll send out a search team first thing in the morning. For now, you should get some rest. We'll talk more once we've had a chance to investigate." I wanted to argue, to make them understand the urgency of the situation. But exhaustion was setting in, the adrenaline that had kept me going finally wearing off. I nodded reluctantly and let the medic check me over for injuries. That night, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature's face, heard its unnatural mimicry. The wind outside my window sounded like whispers, and more than once I caught myself straining to make out words in the noise. The search team was dispatched at first light. I wasn't allowed to join them despite my protests. Instead, I paced the station, jumping at every crackle of the radio, every ring of the phone. Hours passed with no word. As the day wore on, my colleagues gave me a wide berth, their sidelong glances a mix of concern and wariness. I overheard snippets of conversation. Stress, isolation. Maybe he needs to transfer somewhere less remote. Finally, as the sun was setting, the search team returned. Their faces were grim, but not with the horror I expected. Instead, they looked confused, almost apologetic. "We found the cabins," Ranger Thompson reported. "The first 2 were just as you described. But the third, Owen, it was locked up tight. No signs of entry, no fire, no steaming tea, and no notebook." I felt the blood drain from my face. "That's impossible. I was there. I saw it all." Thompson shook his head. "We did find the maintenance shed. It was burned, just like you said. But the fire investigator thinks it was caused by a faulty propane tank, probably been leaking for months." "And the tracks?" I asked desperately. "The claw marks?" "We found some unusual tracks," Thompson admitted, "but nothing we could definitively say wasn't from known wildlife. As for the claw marks, bears sometimes sharpen their claws on cabin walls. It's not common, but it happens." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Had I imagined it all? But the terror I felt, the creature I saw, it had all been so real. In the days that followed, I was put on administrative leave. The official report cited stress-induced hallucinations, likely brought on by isolation and the harsh winter conditions. I was ordered to undergo a psychological evaluation before being allowed back on active duty. but I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced. And I couldn't shake the feeling that by dismissing my story we were leaving the park, and its visitors, vulnerable to something beyond our understanding. A week after my encounter, a group of hikers went missing in the same area where I had my experience. Their disappearance sent a chill down my spine, but I was still on leave, relegated to the sidelines as the search and rescue operation commenced. Days passed with no sign of the missing hikers. The park was abuzz with activity. Rangers, volunteers, and even a few psychics brought in by desperate family members. I tried to help, to offer what I knew, but my warnings were politely brushed aside. On the 5th day, they found the bodies. The official report cited an animal attack, likely a bear or wolf pack. But when I managed to get a look at the photos, my blood ran cold. The patterns of injury were all wrong, too erratic, too precise. And there, barely visible in one image, was a set of tracks identical to the ones I had seen outside the cabin. I tried to bring this to the attention of Chief Hodges, but he shut me down. "Owen, I know you want to help, but you're not thinking clearly. We have experts analyzing this. Let them do their job." Frustrated and increasingly isolated, I began my own investigation. I pored over historical records, spoke to local indigenous elders, and reached out to cryptozoologists, anyone who might have information about what I had encountered. Most dismissed me as another crackpot, but a few listened. An anthropology professor from the University of Alaska showed particular interest. She shared stories of a creature from Athabascan folklore, a shape-shifting predator that could mimic the voices of its prey. The locals called it the imitator, and it was said to hunt in the deepest, darkest parts of the forest. Armed with this information, I became more convinced than ever that what I had encountered was real. But how could I prove it? How could I make others see the danger that lurked in the wilderness we were meant to protect? As winter deepened, more incidents occurred. Nothing as dramatic as the hiker deaths, but enough to keep me on edge. Rangers reported equipment malfunctions in specific areas of the park. Visitors complained of feeling watched, of hearing voices calling them off the marked trails. I kept meticulous notes, mapping each occurrence, looking for patterns. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. The incidents were concentrated in a roughly circular area, with the cabin where I had my encounter at its center. But every time I tried to present my findings, I was shut down. My colleagues were sympathetic but firm. There was no evidence of anything out of the ordinary, just the usual challenges of managing a vast wilderness area. As spring approached, I made a decision. If no one would believe me, I would have to find proof myself. I began planning an expedition back to the site of my encounter. This time I would be prepared. This time I would bring back evidence that no one could deny. Little did I know the creature was planning too. Our paths were set to cross again in a confrontation that would change everything I thought I knew about the natural world and my place in it. The plan came together slowly, meticulously. I couldn't risk official channels. My psych evaluation was still pending, and any hint of my intentions would likely result in my immediate dismissal. Instead, I reached out to a few trusted friends outside the Park Service. Mike, an old college buddy who'd gone into wildlife photography, agreed to come along. His expertise with cameras, including some high-tech gear designed for nocturnal animals, would be invaluable. Then there was Dr. Leanne Harper, the anthropology professor who'd shown interest in my story. She was eager to join, seeing it as an opportunity to possibly confirm centuries-old folklore. We set out in early June, just as the last of the snow was melting. The official story was that we were conducting a routine wildlife survey. It wasn't entirely a lie. We were looking for wildlife, just not the kind listed in any field guide. The journey to the cabin was tense. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush set my nerves on edge. Mike and Leanne tried to keep the mood light, but I could see the worry in their eyes. They believed me, or at least believed that I believed, but facing the unknown had a way of shaking even the most steadfast resolve. We made camp about a mile from the cabin, not wanting to disturb any potential evidence. As night fell, we set up our equipment: motion-activated cameras, audio recorders, even some experimental pheromone traps Leanne had acquired from a colleague in zoology. The first 2 nights passed uneventfully. We took turns keeping watch, but saw nothing more threatening than the occasional curious fox or owl. By the third night, I could sense Mike and Leanne's growing skepticism. They didn't say anything, but their exchanged glances spoke volumes. It was nearing midnight on the fourth night when it happened. I was on watch, Mike and Leanne asleep in the tent behind me. The forest had gone eerily quiet. No wind, no animal sounds, just a heavy stillness that seemed to press in from all sides. Then I heard it, a soft, chittering sound, just like I'd heard months ago. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I fumbled for the audio recorder, my hands shaking as I pressed the button. "Mike, Leanne," I whispered urgently, "wake up, it's here." They emerged from the tent, rubbing sleep from their eyes. "What's going?" Mike started to ask, but I held up a hand, signaling for silence. The chittering grew louder, more insistent, then suddenly it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse, filled with a palpable sense of anticipation. A twig snapped somewhere to our left. We all turned, Mike raising his camera on instinct. For a moment, nothing. Then, emerging from the shadows, I saw it again. That same nightmarish figure that had haunted my dreams for months. It stood at the edge of our camp, its eyes reflecting the firelight. This time I wasn't alone in seeing it. I heard Leanne's sharp intake of breath, felt Mike tense beside me. "Oh my God," Leanne whispered, "it's real." The creature tilted its head, regarding us with an unsettling intelligence. Then it opened its mouth, and I braced myself for the mimicry I knew was coming. But instead of a stolen voice, what emerged was something far more chilling. A series of clicks and whistles, almost like language. It was communicating, but not in any way we could understand. Mike's camera whirred as he snapped photo after photo. The sound seemed to agitate the creature. It took a step forward, its claws digging into the soft earth. "We need to leave," I said, my voice low and urgent. "Now." We began to back away slowly, never taking our eyes off the creature. It matched our movements, step for step, maintaining the distance between us. Then, from somewhere in the darkness behind it came an answering call. The same clicks and whistles, but from a different voice. The creature turned its head slightly at the sound, and in that moment of distraction, we ran. We crashed through the underbrush, abandoning our campsite and most of our gear. Behind us, I could hear the creatures giving chase, their strange calls echoing through the trees. How long we ran, I couldn't say. Time seemed to blur, marked only by the pounding of our hearts and the burning in our lungs. Finally, we broke through the tree line onto one of the main park roads. In the distance, I could see the headlights of an approaching vehicle. We flagged it down frantically. It was a park ranger on night patrol. As we clambered into the truck, I glanced back at the forest. There, just at the edge of the trees, I saw them. Not one creature, but three, watching us with those eerily intelligent eyes. As we drove away, I knew our ordeal wasn't over. We had our proof now, photos, audio recordings, multiple witnesses. But I also knew that we had stumbled onto something far bigger and more complex than I had ever imagined. The creatures weren't just real. They were organized, communicative, possibly even social. And they were still out there, hidden in the vast wilderness of Denali, watching and waiting. Our discovery would shake the foundations of what we thought we knew about the natural world, but it would also open up a Pandora's box of questions, ethical, ecological, and existential. As we sped back towards civilization, I couldn't help but wonder, in our quest for proof, had we just changed the course of history? And more importantly, were we ready for the consequences of what we had unleashed? The park remains one of the most beautiful places I've ever known. But beauty often hides secrets, and some of those secrets, I've learned, are best left undisturbed. As for me, I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. Every rustle in the bushes, every unidentified sound in the night now carries the weight of possibility and the chill of the unknown. In the days that followed our encounter, the world as we knew it changed irrevocably. The evidence we brought back, Mike's photographs, our audio recordings, and our eyewitness accounts, was undeniable. At first, the Park Service tried to keep it under wraps, but in the age of the internet, such secrets don't stay buried for long. Within weeks, the story had broken. News crews descended on Denali like a swarm of locusts. Cryptozoologists, scientists, and thrill-seekers all clamored for access to the area where we had our encounter. The park was temporarily closed to the public, ostensibly for their safety, but really to give the authorities time to figure out how to handle this unprecedented situation. I found myself thrust into the spotlight, my earlier warnings now vindicated. Interviews, press conferences, meetings with government officials. My days became a blur of explanations and speculations. Dr. Harper's expertise proved invaluable as we tried to contextualize our discovery within the framework of known science and folklore. But amidst the chaos and excitement, a sobering reality began to set in. The creatures, which the media had dubbed Denali mimics, were now exposed. Their habitat, their very existence, was under threat from human curiosity and ambition. Conservation groups argued for the immediate protection of the mimics and their territory. Others saw potential for study, for unlocking the secrets of their unique abilities. And then there were those who viewed them as a threat to be eliminated. As the debate raged on, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. We had sought the truth, and in finding it, we had irreversibly altered the delicate balance of this hidden ecosystem. The very wilderness I had sworn to protect was now at the center of a storm I had helped create. Months passed, and still no consensus was reached on how to proceed. The park remained closed, guarded by a joint task force of park rangers and military personnel. Research teams were allowed limited access, but their findings were kept strictly confidential. In the meantime, there were more sightings. The mimics, it seemed, were expanding their territory, venturing closer to the edges of the park. Whether this was due to curiosity or feeling threatened, no one could say for certain. One crisp autumn morning, I was called into a high-level meeting at park headquarters. Representatives from various government agencies were present, along with Dr. Harper and a few other scientists who had been studying the mimics. The atmosphere was tense as we were briefed on the latest developments. The mimics had shown signs of increased intelligence and adaptability. There were concerns about their potential to spread beyond the park's boundaries, and the implications this could have for local ecosystems and human settlements. As the discussion turned to containment strategies and potential military intervention, I felt a knot forming in my stomach. This was wrong. We were approaching this all wrong. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. All eyes turned to me. "We're making a mistake," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "These creatures have been here long before us, living in harmony with their environment. It's not our place to contain them or drive them out. We need to learn to coexist." My words were met with a mix of skepticism and consideration. But as I continued to speak, laying out a plan for protected zones and controlled study areas, I could see minds starting to change. It wouldn't be easy. It would require a complete rethinking of how we managed the park and interacted with its inhabitants. But it was the right thing to do. 5 years have passed since that fateful meeting. Denali National Park looks different now. Large sections are permanently closed to the public, designated as protected habitats for the mimics. The remaining areas have strict visitation rules and enhanced security measures. I've taken on a new role as head of the Mimic Research and Conservation Unit. Our team works tirelessly to study these remarkable creatures while ensuring their protection. We've learned so much about their social structures, their communication methods, even the evolutionary path that led to their unique abilities. But for every question we answer, a dozen more arise. The mimics remain as mysterious as they are fascinating, a constant reminder of how little we truly know about the world around us. Visitors still come to Denali, drawn by its rugged beauty and the tantalizing possibility of glimpsing a mimic. Most leave without seeing one, but that's as it should be. The wilderness keeps its secrets, revealing them only to those patient and respectful enough to earn its trust. As for me, I often think back to that night in the cabin, when I first encountered the unknown. The fear I felt then has been replaced by a profound sense of wonder and responsibility. We stand at the threshold of a new era of discovery, one that challenges us to expand our understanding of life itself. The vast expanse of Denali stretches out before me, a land of mystery and possibility. In the distance I hear a familiar chittering sound. A smile crosses my face as I turn back towards the ranger station. There's still so much work to be done, so much to learn, But one thing is certain, the wilderness will never be the same again, and neither will we. This happened in the 1990s, 1994 to be exact. The mist hung low over the Tongass National Forest, cloaking the towering Sitka spruces in a ghostly shroud. I never imagined I'd trade the dry heat of Arizona for the damp chill of Alaska, but life has a funny way of turning tables when you're not looking. My name's Leopold Finch, Leo for short. In 1994, I took up a post as a park ranger here in Tongass, the largest national forest in the United States. Fresh air, solitude, and a chance to escape a past that clung to me like tar. That was the dream. Funny how dreams and nightmares often share the same bed. I was always the guy who cracked jokes at the worst possible moments. Maybe it's a defense mechanism, or maybe I just enjoy the sound of groans more than laughter. Like I used to say, I'm not lazy. I'm on energy-saving mode. Not exactly stand-up material, but it kept things light during long patrols. My first day in Tongass was a baptism by rain, the kind of rain that doesn't so much fall as it envelops you, seeping into your bones and leaving you wondering if you'll ever be dry again. The ranger station, a sturdy log cabin that had seen better days, loomed before me like a sentinel. As I approached, the door swung open, revealing a weathered face framed by salt and pepper hair. "You must be the new guy," the man said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "I'm Hank, Chief Ranger." I extended my hand, plastering on my best pleased to meet you smile. "Leopold Finch." "Leo, if you're into the whole brevity thing." Hank's handshake was firm, calloused palm speaking of years in the wilderness. "Well, Leo, welcome to Tongass. Hope you like green." As Hank gave me the tour, I couldn't help but feel like I'd stepped into another world. The forest pressed in from all sides, ancient and forbidding. The trees here didn't just grow, they loomed, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. I suppressed a shiver, chalking it up to the damp chill. "You'll be patrolling the eastern sector," Hank explained, pointing to a map on the wall. "It's mostly quiet, but we've had some issues with unauthorized hunters lately. Keep your eyes peeled." I nodded, trying to look more confident than I felt. "No problem. I'll have them running scared with my killer jokes in no time." Hank raised an eyebrow. "Just don't scare off the wildlife. We need them more than your jokes." As night fell, I settled into my new quarters, a small cabin on the edge of the ranger compound. The forest sounds were alien to me, a symphony of creaks, rustles, and distant howls that set my nerves on edge. I tried to convince myself it was just the adjustment period, that I'd get used to it. But as I lay in bed, staring at the shadows dancing on the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by strange dreams. In one, I was running through the forest, pursued by something I couldn't see but could feel breathing down my neck. Just as it was about to catch me, I jolted awake, heart pounding and sheets damp with sweat. "Get it together, Leo," I muttered to myself. "It's just a forest. What's the worst that could happen?" Little did I know I was about to find out. The morning started like any other, a lukewarm cup of coffee and a stale bagel I wouldn't feed to a moose. The radio crackled to life. "Leo, we've got reports of unauthorized hunters near the eastern perimeter," came Janet's voice, sharp as ever. Janet was our dispatch operator, a no-nonsense woman who could probably run the entire forest single-handedly if she wanted to. I'd only known her for a day, but I already had a healthy respect for her efficiency. "Copy that. Heading there now," I replied. "If I don't make it back, tell my mom I finally learned how to fold a fitted sheet." "Noted," she said dryly. "Try not to start a war out there." I grabbed my gear and set off along the gravel path that wound through the forest like a serpent. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of pine and damp earth. Birds chattered overhead, oblivious to the human concerns below. About an hour into the hike, I noticed something odd, a silence that pressed in like a held breath. The birds had gone quiet, and even the wind seemed to have taken leave. It reminded me of the calm before a storm, that pregnant pause where the world teeters on the edge of something unseen. I shrugged it off. "Probably just my sparkling personality scaring them away," I muttered. Continuing on, I spotted tracks veering off the main path, boot prints deep and erratic. They weren't part of any trail I knew, and curiosity got the better of me. Well, Leo, what's the worst that could happen? I said to myself, conveniently forgetting all the horror movies that start with that exact sentiment. Following the prints, I entered a denser part of the forest where the canopy above knitted together, casting everything in perpetual twilight. The ground squelched underfoot, and a faint odor hung in the air, metallic and sour. It reminded me of the time I'd stumbled upon a dead coyote back in Arizona, the stench of decay unmistakable. I came upon a clearing littered with the remains of a campsite, a torn tent, scattered belongings, and was that a shoe hanging from a branch? This doesn't scream happy campers, I said, unease gnawing at the edges of my bravado. I radioed in. Janet, you there? Found an abandoned campsite at grid reference 3 Alpha. Looks like it was ransacked. Static. Great of all days for technology to give me the cold shoulder. As I surveyed the wreckage, something caught my eye, a crude carving on a tree trunk. It resembled a wolf but distorted, almost humanoid. The figure was elongated with 2 long limbs and a head that seemed to melt into its shoulders. Deep gouges surrounded the carving, as if someone, or something, had clawed at the tree in a frenzy. Art critic I'm not, but that's one ugly mural, I said, trying to lighten the mood. My voice sounded hollow in the eerie silence. A rustling sound pulled my attention. From the corner of my eye, I saw a movement, a shadow darting between the trees. Hello? Park ranger here. If you're lost, I've got a map, and if you're hiding, I've got a very loud whistle. Silence. I walked toward where I thought I'd seen the movement. The underbrush was thick, resisting my every step. Pushing past the thicket, I nearly stumbled into a small pit. At first glance, it looked like a sinkhole, but then I noticed the bones. Animal bones, I hoped, scattered at the bottom. They were picked clean, bleached white by sun and rain, but something about them seemed off. Some were too large to belong to the typical forest denizens, and others looked disturbingly human-like. Well, that's not foreboding at all, I whispered. A low chuckle echoed behind me. I spun around, heart pounding. Who's there? Nothing. Okay, Leo, either you're losing it, or someone's playing a very unfunny prank. I decided it was time to head back. As I retraced my steps, the forest seemed unfamiliar, as if the trees had shifted in my absence. After what felt like an hour, I realized I was going in circles. Panic started to bubble up, but I pushed it down. Lost in the woods, every park ranger's secret shame, I muttered. I tried the radio again. Janet, do you copy? This time, a garbled voice came through. EO, get out! Janet, repeat that. You're breaking up. Not alone. Run. The line went dead. Well, that's sufficiently creepy. A sudden scream pierced the air, a man's voice filled with terror. Without thinking, I ran toward the sound. Breaking through a dense patch of ferns, I entered another clearing. The sight stopped me cold. A fellow ranger. I recognized him as Greg, one of the veterans I'd met briefly during orientation, lay on the ground. His body was torn apart, eyes wide in a lifeless stare. Blood soaked the moss beneath him, and deep gashes crisscrossed his torso. Oh no, Greg. I felt a surge of nausea but forced it down. A guttural sound rumbled nearby. Emerging from behind a fallen log was a creature unlike anything I'd ever imagined. It stood on 2 legs, towering over me by at least 3 feet. Its body was covered in matted fur, patches of which were missing to reveal slick, gray skin. The face was elongated like a deer's, but twisted, with sharp antlers that branched out like gnarled fingers. Well, that's not Bambi, I said, stepping back slowly. The creature tilted its head, black eyes reflecting no light. It sniffed the air and bared a set of jagged teeth. I glanced at Greg's body and then back at the beast. Look, if this is about trespassing, I can leave. No hard feelings. It let out a shriek that rattled my teeth and lunged forward. I dove to the side, feeling its claws graze my arm, a burning slash that seared instantly. Scrambling to my feet, I bolted. Adrenaline surged, and the forest became a blur of green and brown. Behind me, I could hear it crashing through the underbrush, gaining ground. Come on, Leo, think, I hissed between ragged breaths. Up ahead, I spotted a narrow ravine. Without hesitation, I leapt across, landing hard on the other side. The creature skidded to a halt at the edge, snarling. "What's the matter? Can't jump?" "Guess those legs are all for show," I shouted, my bravado thin and cracking. It paced along the ravine's edge, eyes never leaving me. I took the moment to assess my options. The pain in my arm was sharp, blood seeping through my torn sleeve. Reaching into my pack, I pulled out a flare. Not exactly a lightsaber, but it'll have to do. I ignited it, the red flame sputtering to life. The creature recoiled slightly. "Ah, so you're not a fan of fireworks." I waved the flare, trying to keep the ravine between us. Slowly I backed away, but my foot caught on a root and I fell hard, the flare rolling out of reach. "Smooth move," I groaned. The beast seized the opportunity, leaping over the gap effortlessly. It stood over me, drool dripping from its maw. "Wait, aren't you supposed to be scared of fire?" I stammered. It snapped its jaws inches from my face. Desperate, I grabbed a handful of dirt and threw it into its eyes. It howled, stumbling back. Seizing the moment, I got to my feet and ran toward a cluster of old mining shacks I'd remembered from maps, abandoned but potentially offering shelter. Reaching the first shack, I slammed the door behind me. The structure was rickety, walls full of gaps, but it was something. I searched frantically for anything useful. In a corner, I found a rusted pickaxe. Not exactly state-of-the-art weaponry, but beggars can't be choosers. The door shook as the creature slammed against it. Wood splintered, and I knew it wouldn't hold. "Come on in, Mikasa es Sukasa," I shouted, positioning myself. The door gave way and the beast charged. I swung the pickaxe with everything I had. It connected with a sickening thud, lodging into the creature's shoulder. It roared in pain, swiping at me and sending me crashing into the wall. Stars exploded in my vision, but I held on to consciousness. The beast struggled, the pickaxe hindering its movement. Seizing the chance, I crawled toward a stack of old dynamite sticks, probably unstable, but better than nothing. "Time to bring down the house," I mumbled. I grabbed a stick, lit it with the lighter I always kept, a habit from my smoking days, and tossed it at the creature's feet. Diving out a side window, I hit the ground as an explosion ripped through the air. Debris flew, and a wave of heat washed over me. Coughing, I got up and looked back at the wreckage. Smoke billowed, and flames licked at the remains of the shack. There was no movement. "Guess that blew your mind," I said weakly. Sirens wailed in the distance. Backup had finally arrived, or maybe someone had reported the explosion. Janet's voice crackled over the radio. "Leo, what's your status? We heard an explosion." "Alive for now. Send medical to my coordinates. Greg is down. There's something else out here." "Understood. Help is on the way." Minutes later, a team arrived. They found me disheveled and bleeding, but alive. Greg's body was recovered, and the area was secured. "Did you see what did this?" one of the officers asked. I hesitated. It was a bear. Had to be. He gave me a skeptical look, but didn't press further. Days later, I sat in the station, arm bandaged, sipping terrible coffee. Reports came in of strange sightings, but nothing concrete. The official story remained a wild animal attack. Janet approached me. "You sure you're okay?" "Never better. Just another day in paradise." She sat down. "You know, if there's more to this..." I cut her off. "Sometimes it's better not to dig too deep. You might not like what you find." She nodded slowly. "Fair enough." As I left the station that evening, the shadows stretched long under the fading light. I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on me, hidden somewhere among the trees. "Well, if you're out there, at least buy me dinner first," I called out to the empty forest. A rustling sounded, but it was just a deer stepping into the clearing. It looked at me briefly before darting away. I chuckled softly. Jumpier than I am. That's a first. I took one last look at the tree line before driving off. Some secrets the forest could keep. I'd had enough adventure to last a lifetime, or at least until my next cup of coffee. But as the days turned into weeks, I couldn't shake the memory of what I'd seen. The creature's face haunted my dreams, and every rustle in the undergrowth set my heart racing. I tried to convince myself it had been a bear, or maybe a wolf, but deep down, I knew better. The other rangers noticed the change in me. Gone was the easygoing jokester, replaced by a man who jumped at shadows and insisted on patrolling in pairs. Hank pulled me aside one day, concern etched on his weathered face. Leo, what really happened out there? He asked, his voice low. I opened my mouth to give him the official story, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I found myself spilling everything: the creature, the chase, the explosion. As I spoke, I watched Hank's expression shift from skepticism to something else. Fear, recognition. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed, suddenly looking much older. You're not the first to see something unusual in these woods, he said. What do you mean? Hank glanced around as if checking for eavesdroppers. There are stories, old stories, passed down by the native tribes. They speak of creatures that walk between worlds, neither human nor animal. Shapeshifters, some call them. Others have less flattering names. I felt a chill run down my spine. And you believe these stories? He shrugged. I've been in these woods for 30 years, Leo. I've seen things that defy explanation. But the Forest Service doesn't want to hear about monsters. They want reports that fit neatly into boxes. Bear attack, wolf sighting, that sort of thing. So we just ignore it? I asked, incredulous. Hank's eyes hardened. We protect people. That's our job. Sometimes that means keeping them in the dark. Despite Hank's warning, I couldn't let it go. The creature I'd encountered, the stories Hank hinted at, they gnawed at me, demanding answers. So I began my own investigation, quiet and off the books. I started with the local library, poring over old newspapers and town records. Most of it was mundane weather reports, announcements of town fairs, the occasional story about a lost hiker. But every now and then, I'd find something that made my blood run cold. 1967, 3 hunters gone missing. Search called off after a week. Their camp was found torn apart as if by a great beast. 1978, local man claims to have seen a wolf walking like a man near Deer Creek. Authorities dismiss it as a hoax. 1985, series of livestock mutilations. Ranchers report seeing large, unidentified animal tracks. The pattern was there if you knew where to look. Every few years something would happen. Disappearances, strange sightings, unexplained deaths. And always it would be explained away. Bear attack, wolf pack, mountain lion. But the more I dug, the less I believed the official explanations. One name kept cropping up in my research: Margaret Redfeather, an elder of the local Tlingit tribe. If anyone knew the old stories Hank had mentioned, it would be her. It took some doing, but I finally managed to arrange a meeting. Margaret lived on the outskirts of a small Tlingit community, her house a modest wooden structure that seemed to blend into the surrounding forest. As I approached, I saw her sitting on the porch, as if she'd been expecting me. "Leopold Finch," she said, her voice strong despite her advanced years. "I've been waiting for you." I blinked in surprise. "You have?" She smiled, the wrinkles around her eyes deepening. "The forest whispers, young man, and lately it's been whispering your name." I sat down across from her, unsure how to begin. Margaret saved me the trouble. "You've seen it, haven't you? The Kushtaka." The word sent a shiver through me. "Is that what it's called?" Margaret nodded. "In our language it means land otter man, but that's a simplification. The Kushtaka is a shapeshifter, a trickster. It can appear as a man, an otter, or something in between. What I saw," I said slowly, "was definitely in between." "Tell me," she said. So I did. I told her everything: the chase, the fight, the explosion. As I spoke, Margaret listened intently, her dark eyes never leaving my face. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice low and urgent. "The Kushtaka is not just one creature, Leopold. It is many. A whole tribe of them lives in these woods, hidden from human eyes most of the time." "But why?" I asked. "Why do they attack people?" Margaret's expression turned grim. "Some say they seek to replenish their numbers by turning humans into one of them. Others believe they are guardians of the forest, punishing those who disrespect nature. The truth, I suspect, is somewhere in between." I thought of Greg, his body torn apart in the clearing. How do we stop them? Stop them? Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Young man, these creatures have been here long before us, and they'll be here long after. You might as well try to stop the tide." "So we just let them kill people?" I couldn't keep the frustration out of my voice. Margaret shook her head. I didn't say that. We can protect ourselves, warn others, but declaring war on the Kushtaka, that would only bring more bloodshed. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the porch, Margaret told me more. She spoke of protective charms, of rituals to ward off the Kushtaka. She told me of signs to watch for, certain bird calls that weren't quite right, tracks that changed from animal to human and back again. By the time I left, my head was spinning with information. But one thing was clear. I was in way over my head. The next few weeks passed in a blur. I threw myself into my work, determined to protect the people who ventured into the forest, even if I couldn't tell them what I was protecting them from. I began leaving warnings, subtle at first, then more overt. I posted signs about increased bear activity, closed off trails near where I'd encountered the Kushtaka, and insisted on giving safety talks to every group that came through. Some of the other rangers began to notice. Janet cornered me one day, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Leo, what's going on? You've got half the forest roped off, and you're scaring tourists with tales of killer bears." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "Janet, trust me, it's for their own good." "Is this about what happened with Greg?" Her voice softened. "Leo, I know it was traumatic, but—" "You don't understand," I cut her off. "There's something out there, Janet. Something worse than bears or wolves or anything you've been trained for." She looked at me for a long moment, then shook her head. "Leo, I think you need to talk to someone, maybe take some time off." But I couldn't take time off. Not when I knew what was lurking in the shadows. As summer turned to fall, the tourist season began to wind down. But for those of us who called the forest home, the real work was just beginning. Winter in Alaska is no joke, and we had to prepare. It was during one of these preparation runs that it happened again. I was checking our emergency shelters, making sure they were stocked with supplies for the winter. The day was overcast, a chill wind whipping through the trees and carrying with it the promise of snow. As I approached the last shelter on my route, I noticed something odd. The door was ajar, swinging gently in the wind. I frowned. These shelters were supposed to be locked when not in use. "Hello?" I called out, one hand on my radio. "Anyone in there?" No response. Cautiously, I approached the shelter. The wind shifted, and a familiar scent hit me, that same metallic, sour smell from the clearing where I'd found Greg. My heart began to race. "This is Ranger Finch," I said into my radio. "I've got a possible situation at Emergency Shelter 17, requesting backup." Static was my only answer. "Of course," I muttered, "because that's just my luck." I drew my sidearm, a precaution I'd taken to carrying ever since my encounter with the Kushtaka. Slowly, I pushed the door open. The interior of the shelter was dark, the window shutters closed. As my eyes adjusted, I made out a figure huddled in the corner. "Sir, ma'am, are you all right?" I asked, my voice echoing in the small space. The figure didn't move. I took a step closer, and that's when I saw it. A pair of eyes reflecting the light from the door, glowing an unnatural yellow. "Oh, shh!" The creature lunged, faster than I could react. I felt a searing pain in my shoulder as claws raked across it. The force of the attack sent me stumbling backward, out of the shelter. I raised my gun, firing off 2 shots. The creature shrieked, a sound that set my teeth on edge, and retreated back into the shadows of the shelter. Blood soaked my jacket, but I couldn't afford to check the wound. I could hear movement inside the shelter, the scrape of claws on wood. "Come on," I growled. "Come and get me, you bastard." As if in answer, the creature burst out of the shelter. In the gray light of day, I got my first clear look at it. It was similar to the one I'd encountered before, but smaller, its fur a mottled gray instead of brown. Its face was more human-like, with a flattened nose and lips pulled back in a snarl to reveal razor-sharp teeth. We faced each other, the creature and I, in a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Then, with a roar that shook the trees, it charged. I fired again and again, the shots echoing through the forest. The creature staggered but kept coming. Just as it reached me, as I could feel its hot breath on my face, a deafening boom split the air. The creature's head exploded in a spray of blood and bone. It collapsed at my feet, twitching. I looked up to see Hank standing there, shotgun in hand. "Told you there were more of them," I said weakly before the world went dark. I came to in the infirmary, my shoulder throbbing and my head feeling like it was stuffed with cotton. Hank was there, his face grim. "Welcome back to the land of the living," he said. I tried to sit up, wincing at the pain. "The creature?" "Dead," Hank confirmed. "We burned the body." I nodded, relief washing over me. Then a thought struck me. "Hank, you believed me. You came prepared." He sighed, suddenly looking every one of his years. "Like I said, Leo, you're not the first to see these things. I've had my own encounters over the years. Why didn't you tell me? Would you have believed me if I had?" He shook his head. "Besides, I hoped it was over. It's been years since the last incident." I absorbed this in silence. Finally, I asked, "What do we do now?" Hank's expression hardened. "Now? Now we fight back." The next few weeks were a flurry of activity. Hank brought in a small group of trusted rangers, Janet among them, and we began to prepare. We couldn't tell the higher-ups the truth, of course. As far as they were concerned, we were dealing with an unusually aggressive bear population. But in secret, we trained. Margaret Redfeather became our unofficial advisor, teaching us the old ways of fighting the Kushtaka. We learned to recognize their signs, to use charms and rituals for protection. And we armed ourselves, not just with guns, but with iron and fire, the old weapons that the stories said could harm these creatures. As winter settled in, transforming the forest into a frozen wonderland, we patrolled in pairs, always on alert. The tourists were gone now, but we knew the real danger was just beginning. It was on one of these patrols, deep in the heart of winter, that we found it, a cave, hidden behind a frozen waterfall. From inside came sounds that made my blood run cold, inhuman shrieks and growls, mixed with something that might have been laughter. "A nest," Hank whispered, his breath frosting in the air. "We found their nest." We retreated to plan our attack. This was it, our chance to end this once and for all. The night of the raid was clear and bitterly cold, the stars sharp points of light in the black sky. Our team moved silently through the snow-covered forest, weapons at the ready. As we approached the cave, an eerie silence fell. No sounds came from within. Had they sensed our approach? "Be ready for anything," Hank murmured. We entered the cave, flashlights cutting through the darkness. The tunnel wound deeper into the earth, the walls slick with ice. And then, suddenly, it opened up into a vast cavern. What we saw there would haunt my nightmares for years to come. Dozens of creatures in various stages between human and beast turned to face us. Some were more otter-like, sleek and sinuous. Others were nightmarish amalgamations of human and animal features. And in the center, larger than the rest, stood what could only be their leader. For a moment, everything was still. Then, with a roar that shook loose ice from the cavern ceiling, the creatures attacked. The battle that followed was chaos. Gunshots echoed off the stone walls, mixed with inhuman shrieks and all too human screams. I saw Janet go down, a creature on top of her, only to drive her iron knife into its throat at the last second. Hank was a whirlwind of destruction, his shotgun booming again and again. And me? I found myself face to face with the leader, a monster twice my size with antlers that scraped the cavern ceiling. It looked at me with terrifying intelligence in its black eyes. "You," it growled, its voice like gravel. "You are the one who challenges us." "Damn right," I snarled back, raising my weapon. We clashed in a fury of claws and bullets. Pain exploded across my body as its claws found purchase, but I gave as good as I got. My iron-tipped bullets tore chunks from its flesh, each hit eliciting a roar of pain and rage. Around us, the battle raged on. I caught glimpses of my teammates fighting for their lives, of Kushtaka falling to bullet and blade. The cavern was filled with smoke and the copper tang of blood. In the end, it came down to a simple thing: luck. The creature lunged at me, jaws wide, to tear out my throat. I stumbled backwards, slipping on the icy floor. As I fell, my finger tightened on the trigger. The shot went wide, hitting the cavern wall. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like thunder, the wall began to crack. The creature turned, distracted by the noise, and I seized my chance. I emptied my clip into its chest, the iron bullets tearing through flesh and bone. It fell, and as it did, the cavern began to collapse. "Everyone out," I yelled, struggling to my feet. "Move!" We ran, half carrying our wounded as the world fell apart behind us. We burst out of the cave just as it collapsed entirely, burying the remaining kushtaka in tons of rock and ice. In the silence that followed, we looked at each other in disbelief. We were battered, bloodied, but alive, and we had won. Years have passed since that night. The official report talks about a cave-in that buried a particularly vicious bear den. Hank retired, Janet took over as chief ranger, and I stayed. Sometimes on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I think I hear echoes of inhuman cries. When I walk through the forest, I feel eyes on me, watching from shadows where no shadow should be. But the attacks have stopped. The forest is quiet, or as quiet as a forest ever is. Yet I know the truth. The kushtaka aren't gone, not really. You can't kill an entire species, especially one as ancient and cunning as they are. Some escaped that night, I'm sure of it. They're out there, waiting, watching. And so I remain, a sentinel in the wilderness. I tell campfire stories to wide-eyed tourists about the dangers of the wild, weaving in warnings they don't even recognize. I patrol the forests, my eyes always searching for signs of their return. Because that's the thing about the wilderness, it keeps its secrets. And some of those secrets have teeth. But hey, it's a living. And if nothing else, it's given me one hell of a story to tell. Just don't expect anyone to believe it. After all, everyone knows there are no monsters in the woods, right? This happened in the 1990s, specifically in 1997. I never imagined that my love for solitude would lead me into such a predicament. Back then, I was stationed at Olympic National Park in Washington State. My name's Thaddeus Langley, but folks just call me Thad. I've always been drawn to the wilderness, a place where a person can hear their own thoughts without the constant buzz of city life. Growing up in a small town taught me to appreciate the simple things, like a good cup of coffee and a bad joke. It was a crisp autumn morning when I set out on what should have been a routine patrol through one of the less traveled sections of the park. The area wasn't popular with tourists, which suited me just fine. I packed my gear, just the essentials: a first aid kit, water, some trail mix, and a flashlight. As I shouldered my backpack, I caught a whiff of pine and damp earth, the smell of the forest awakening. The canopy above was thick, filtering the sunlight into a soft green glow that made everything feel alive. The familiar crunch of leaves and twigs beneath my boots was oddly comforting as I made my way deeper into the woods. Birds chirped their morning songs, and occasionally I'd spot a squirrel darting up a tree trunk. A couple of hours into my hike, I stumbled upon something unusual. At first, I almost missed it, my eyes scanning the forest floor for any signs of disturbance. But as I looked up, my breath caught in my throat. There, on the trunks of several trees, were deep gouges, claw marks, unlike anything I'd seen before. I approached the nearest tree, running my fingers along the grooves. They were higher than any bear could reach, and spaced too closely to be the result of antlers rubbing against the bark. The wood was splintered and torn, as if something with immense strength had raked its claws down the trunk in a frenzy. A chill ran down my spine despite the warmth of the day. I took a few photos with my phone, making a mental note to report it back at the station. As I continued my patrol, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The usual sounds of the forest birdsong, rustling leaves, had fallen silent. It was as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I laughed at myself, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. "Get a grip, Thad," I muttered. "You're letting your imagination get the better of you." But even as I said the words, I couldn't quite convince myself they were true. As the day wore on, the silence became more pronounced. I found myself straining to hear any sound, a bird call, the scurrying of small animals, anything to break the eerie quiet. But there was nothing, just the sound of my own breathing and the occasional snap of a twig beneath my feet. Around midday, I reached a small clearing where I planned to have lunch. The open space should have been a relief after the densely packed trees, but instead it felt exposed. As I unwrapped my sandwich, I noticed an unnatural stillness. No wind, no insects buzzing, nothing. I took a bite of my sandwich, but it tasted like ash in my mouth. My eyes kept darting to the tree line, searching for what? I didn't know. But every instinct I had was screaming that something wasn't right. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A large figure darted between the trees, too fast for me to get a clear look. My heart leapt into my throat. Probably just a deer, I muttered, though I wasn't convinced. The figure had seemed too large, too wrong to be a deer. I decided it was time to head back. As I packed up, a pungent odor hit me like a physical force. It was a mix of wet dog and decaying meat, so strong it made my eyes water. I gagged, covering my nose with my sleeve. Scanning the area, I saw nothing out of the ordinary, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable now. With shaking hands, I shouldered my pack and set off back down the trail. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me spinning around, sure I was about to come face to face with something. But each time there was nothing there. On the trail back, I found footprints in the soft ground. They were huge, unlike any animal tracks I'd ever seen before. They were elongated, with what looked like 4 toes ending in sharp points. I took a photo, my hands trembling as I held the phone. Whatever had made these prints was no ordinary forest creature. I pressed on, my pace quickening with each step. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. The light was fading now, shadows lengthening and deepening. Every shape seemed to hide a potential threat. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the trees. I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. It wasn't human, but it didn't sound entirely animal either. It was a sound of rage and hunger, of something ancient and primal. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I tried to pinpoint the direction of the sound, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once, reverberating off the trees. Then I saw it. A massive creature emerged from the shadows about 50 yards ahead. It stood upright, at least 8 feet tall, with matted fur the color of ash. Its limbs were long and sinewy, ending in clawed hands that looked capable of tearing through steel. The head resembled that of a hyena, but distorted. Jaws too large, teeth too many. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. The creature locked eyes with me, and for a moment neither of us moved. Its eyes were a sickly yellow, filled with an intelligence that sent shivers down my spine. This was no mindless beast. There was something eerily human in that gaze. Then it snarled, lips pulling back to reveal rows of jagged teeth, and it charged. Instinct kicked in. I turned and ran as fast as I could, adrenaline surging through my veins. The trail twisted and turned, but I didn't dare look back. I could hear branches snapping and heavy footfalls gaining on me. The creature's hot, rancid breath seemed to be right at my neck. Up ahead, I spotted a fallen tree leaning against a rocky outcrop, forming a small crevice. Without thinking, I dove into the gap, squeezing myself into the tight space. The creature thundered past, unable to stop its momentum. I held my breath, pressing myself as far back into the crevice as I could. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure the creature would hear it. The sound of its movement slowed, and I heard it sniffing the air. It let out a guttural sound of frustration that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, cramped and trembling. Every muscle in my body ached, but I didn't dare move. I could hear the creature pacing back and forth, its claws scraping against the rocks. It knew I was close. Eventually the noises faded. I strained my ears, trying to determine if it was safe to emerge. The forest was silent once more, but I knew I wasn't out of danger yet. I needed to get back to the station and alert the others. Cautiously, I crawled out of my hiding spot, every nerve on high alert. The forest seemed different now, menacing. Shadows danced at the edges of my vision, and every sound made me flinch. I picked up a sturdy branch, clutching it like a lifeline. It wasn't much of a weapon against that creature, but it was better than nothing. As I made my way back along the trail, I stumbled upon a gruesome scene that would haunt me for years to come. 3 hikers lay scattered across the path, their bodies torn and lifeless. Blood stained the ground, turning the earth a deep, rusty red. I recognized one of them, a young man named Eric, who had checked in at the station that morning. His face was frozen in an expression of terror, eyes wide and staring at nothing. A surge of anger mixed with fear welled up inside me. These people had no chance against whatever that thing was. I fumbled for my radio, hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. "This is Ranger Langley," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Emergency at Sector 4. We have casualties. Need immediate backup." The reply was garbled, barely audible through the static. All I managed to hear was, "Coming, stay," before the line went dead. Knowing help might be on the way, I decided to see if I could find any survivors. As I searched the area, my stomach churning at the carnage around me, I heard a faint groan. Hope surged through me as I rushed towards the sound. One of the hikers, a woman in her 30s, was still alive, though barely. She had deep gashes across her torso, and her breathing was shallow and labored. "Hang in there," I said, kneeling beside her and applying pressure to her wounds. "Help is coming." Her eyes flickered open, unfocused and filled with pain. "It came out of nowhere," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know," I said, trying to sound calm and reassuring. "Just stay with me, okay? You're going to be all right." She nodded weakly, then her eyes closed and she went still. I checked for a pulse, praying to feel something, anything, but there was nothing. She was gone. I sat back on my heels, my hands covered in blood, feeling utterly helpless. The weight of the situation pressed down on me like a physical force. These people had come here for adventure, for the beauty of nature, and instead had met a violent end at the hands of something that shouldn't exist. I needed to do something before more lives were lost. As much as every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible, I knew I couldn't leave knowing that thing was still out there. Gathering what little resolve I had left, I decided to lure the creature away from any populated areas. I figured making myself bait wasn't the smartest plan, but it was the only one I had. I picked up a fallen branch and fashioned it into a makeshift torch using some dry grass and a lighter I always carried. "All right, ugly," I muttered, trying to psych myself up. "Let's finish this." I set the torch ablaze and waved it above my head, shouting at the top of my lungs. The noise echoed through the forest, shattering the eerie silence. My voice cracked and broke, but I kept yelling, daring the creature to come and get me. It didn't take long for the creature to appear, its eyes reflecting the firelight with a malevolent gleam. It emerged from the shadows like a nightmare made flesh, saliva dripping from its massive jaws. It charged again, but this time I stood my ground, every muscle tensed and ready to move. At the last moment I sidestepped and swung the torch, striking it across the face. The flames caught on its fur and it recoiled, shrieking in pain and rage. Seizing the opportunity, I ran deeper into the woods, leading it away from the main trails. The creature followed, enraged and relentless. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush behind me, gaining ground with every stride. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but I pushed on. I reached a ravine I remembered from earlier patrols, a steep drop into rocky terrain. With the creature closing in, I knew I had one shot. I leapt across the gap, my body suspended in air for what felt like an eternity. I landed hard on the other side, my ankle twisting with a sickening pop. A jolt of pain shot up my leg, but I barely had time to register it. The creature skidded to a halt at the edge, its momentum nearly carrying it over. For a moment it teetered, claws scrambling for purchase on the loose soil. Our eyes met, and in that instant I saw something I never expected: fear. Then the ground gave way and it plummeted into the ravine below. Its scream of rage turned to one of terror as it fell, echoing off the rocks until it was abruptly cut short. I limped to the edge and looked down, my heart pounding. The creature lay motionless among the rocks, its body twisted at unnatural angles. I wasn't sure if it was dead, but it wasn't getting up anytime soon. Exhausted and in pain, I made my way back toward the station, using the trees for support. Every step was agony, but the adrenaline kept me going. As I emerged from the forest, I saw a team of rangers and emergency personnel waiting. Relief washed over me, and my legs finally gave out. "Thad, over here," someone called. I collapsed to the ground, the world spinning around me. Medics rushed over, checking my injuries and peppering me with questions. My supervisor, Mark, knelt beside me, his face etched with concern. "What happened out there?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. "There's something in the ravine about 2 miles east," I said between labored breaths. "It attacked some hikers. They're gone." Mark exchanged glances with the others, his expression unreadable. "We'll send a team to investigate," he said. "Right now, let's get you taken care of." As they loaded me into an ambulance, I couldn't help but wonder what would happen when they found the creature, or if they would find it at all. The forest had kept its secrets for millennia. Who was I to think I could uncover them all in one day? A few days later, I was back at the station, my ankle wrapped and my arm in a sling from the scratches I'd sustained. The official report listed the incident as a bear attack, but I knew better. When I questioned the higher-ups about what they'd found in the ravine, they gave me the bureaucratic runaround. "Let it go, Thad," Mark advised one evening as we were closing up the office. "Sometimes it's better not to dig too deep." I wanted to argue, to demand answers, but the look in his eyes stopped me. There was something there, fear, maybe, or resignation. It was clear he knew more than he was letting on, but for whatever reason he couldn't or wouldn't share it. I decided to take his advice, at least for now. After all, arguing with management was like trying to teach a pig to sing. It wastes your time and annoys the pig. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. That night, as I was leaving the station, I found a note slipped under the door. The paper was old and yellowed, the handwriting shaky but legible. It read, "Be careful in the woods, not everything is as it seems, the old ones are waking." I chuckled, but it was a hollow sound. "No kidding," I muttered, pocketing the note. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone watching me from the shadows, but the parking lot was empty save for my beat-up truck. As I drove home, the words from the note echoed in my mind. "The old ones are waking." What did that mean, and who had left the message? I had a sinking feeling that my encounter in the woods was just the beginning of something much larger and more terrifying than I could imagine. The next morning, despite my injuries and the lingering fear, I was back on patrol. As I walked the familiar trails, I kept my eyes open and my senses sharp. But the forest seemed normal again, the birds singing and the leaves rustling in the breeze. It was as if nothing had happened, as if the horrors of a few days ago were just a bad dream. Dave, another ranger, caught up with me about an hour into my patrol. "Heard you had quite the adventure," he said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You could say that," I replied, not sure how much he knew about what had really happened. "Think you'll take some time off?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes searching my face. I shook my head. "Nah, the trees would miss me too much." He laughed, but it sounded forced. "You're a glutton for punishment, Thad." "Better than a desk job," I shot back, trying to keep things light. We continued our patrol, the sun filtering through the branches above. Life went on, as it tends to do, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was holding more secrets than I'd ever know. As we reached a fork in the trail, Dave turned to me, his expression suddenly serious. "You sure you want to keep doing this, Thad? After what happened?" I hesitated, considering his question. The memory of that creature, its inhuman eyes and razor-sharp claws, flashed through my mind. But beneath the fear there was something else, a burning curiosity, a need to understand what was really going on in these woods. "I have a knack for finding trouble," I said finally, managing a wry smile. Might as well put it to good use. Dave studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "All right then, adventure awaits." We headed down the path, the day's possibilities stretching out before us. But as we walked, I couldn't help but feel that we were being watched. The forest seemed to close in around us, the shadows deepening despite the bright afternoon sun. "Dave," I said quietly, not wanting to alarm him, "does anything feel off to you?" He glanced at me, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" I was about to explain when a twig snapped loudly somewhere to our left. We both froze, scanning the underbrush. For a moment all was still. Then, without warning, a figure burst from the trees. It was a man, or what was left of one. His clothes were in tatters, his skin pale and mottled with dark bruises. But it was his eyes that caught my attention. They were completely black, no whites visible at all. "Help me," he rasped, stumbling towards us. His movements were jerky, unnatural, as if his body wasn't quite under his control. Dave took a step back, his hand moving to the radio at his belt. But before he could call for backup, the man lunged at him with inhuman speed. I reacted on instinct, tackling the stranger and sending us both tumbling to the ground. Up close, the smell of decay was overwhelming. I struggled to pin him down, but his strength was incredible. "Dave," I shouted, "get help." But Dave stood frozen, his eyes wide with terror. The man, if he could still be called that, thrashed beneath me, his mouth opening impossibly wide to reveal rows of sharpened teeth. Just as I thought I was about to lose my grip, a gunshot rang out. The man went limp, a dark fluid oozing from a wound in his head. I scrambled away, my heart pounding. Dave lowered his service weapon, his hands shaking. What the hell was that?" he whispered. I shook my head, unable to form words. The body on the ground was already beginning to decompose at an alarming rate, the flesh melting away like candle wax. "We need to report this," Dave said, his voice trembling. But as he reached for his radio again, a new sound filled the air. It was a low, pulsing hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The very air around us began to shimmer, like heat waves rising from hot pavement. "Dave," I said, a note of urgency in my voice, "we need to go. Now." He nodded and we turned to run. But the forest had changed. The trees seemed to shift and move, the paths we knew so well twisting into unfamiliar shapes. It was as if the woods themselves were coming alive, determined to keep us trapped. We ran blindly, branches whipping at our faces, roots seeming to reach up to trip us. The humming grew louder, drowning out the sound of our labored breathing and pounding footsteps. Suddenly the ground dropped away beneath our feet. We tumbled down a steep incline, rolling through underbrush and over rocks. When we finally came to a stop, battered and bruised, we found ourselves in a clearing unlike any I'd seen before in the park. Stone monoliths stood in a perfect circle, their surfaces covered in strange, swirling symbols that seemed to move when you looked at them directly. In the center of the circle was a pit, and from it rose a column of shimmering energy that pulsed in time with the humming that still filled the air. "Thad," Dave said, his voice barely above a whisper, "what is this place?" Before I could answer, a figure stepped out from behind one of the monoliths. It was Mark, our supervisor, but there was something different about him. His eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and when he spoke, his voice seemed to echo with other, inhuman tones. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his expression a mixture of sadness and resigned determination. "You don't understand what's at stake." "Then explain it to us," I said, slowly getting to my feet. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I stood my ground. Mark sighed, the sound carrying a weight of ages. "The old ones are waking," he said, echoing the words from the note I'd found. "They've slept for millennia, but now they stir. This forest, this whole park, it's built on their resting place. We've been keeping them contained, but the barriers are weakening." "We?" Dave asked, his voice shaking. "Who's we?" "An order older than human civilization," Mark replied. "We've dedicated our lives to keeping the old ones asleep, to protecting humanity from horrors it can't even imagine. But we're losing the battle." As if in response to his words, the humming intensified. The column of energy in the center of the clearing pulsed brighter, and I could have sworn I saw shapes moving within it, vast, incomprehensible forms that hurt my eyes to look at directly. "What can we do?" I asked, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. Mark looked at me, his glowing eyes seeming to peer into my very soul. "You have a choice to make," he said. "You can walk away from this, forget everything you've seen. We'll make sure of that. Or, Dave prompted. "Or you can join us," Mark finished. "Help us fight back the darkness. But know this, if you choose this path, your lives will never be the same. You'll see things that will haunt you until your dying day. You'll face dangers you can't even imagine, and you may not survive." I looked at Dave, saw the fear and uncertainty in his eyes, but beneath that I saw something else, determination, and a flicker of the same curiosity that burned within me. "I'm in," I said, turning back to Mark. "Whatever this is, whatever's coming, I want to help stop it." Dave nodded, squaring his shoulders. "Me too." Mark's expression softened, a hint of his old self showing through. "I hoped you'd say that," he said. "We need all the help we can get." As if on cue, the humming reached a fever pitch. The ground began to shake, and cracks appeared in the earth around the glowing pit. "It's starting," Mark said, his voice grim. "Are you ready?" I looked at Dave, then back at Mark. The forest around us seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, and I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. But strangely, I felt more alive than I had in years. "Ready as we'll ever be," I said. And with that, we stepped forward to face whatever horrors the awakening old ones had in store for us. The once peaceful forest had become a battleground. and we were the last line of defense between our world and unimaginable terror. As we approached the pulsing energy, I couldn't help but think, just another day in the park? Not quite. But then again, I'd always known the wilderness held more secrets than most people realized. I just never imagined I'd be the one to uncover them. The adventure that lay ahead would test us in ways we couldn't possibly fathom. But in that moment, standing on the precipice of the unknown with my friends beside me, I felt a strange sense of purpose. Whatever came next, we'd face it together. And so our real journey began, not as simple park rangers, but as guardians of a secret war that had raged beneath the surface of our world for eons. The trees whispered ancient secrets, the shadows held untold dangers, and we stood ready to meet them all. After all, what's the worst that could happen? As it turns out, we were about to find out. The energy surrounding us intensified, the air crackling with an otherworldly power that made the hair on my arms stand on end. Mark raised his hands, fingers splayed, and began chanting in a language I'd never heard before. The symbols on the monoliths flared to life, pulsing in rhythm with his words. "What do we do?" Dave shouted over the increasing roar of the vortex. Mark paused his chanting long enough to reply, "Focus your will on the barrier. Imagine pushing back against the force, trying to break through." It sounded crazy, but given everything we'd seen, I was willing to try anything. I closed my eyes, picturing an invisible wall between us and whatever was trying to emerge from that swirling vortex. Beside me, I could feel Dave doing the same. The ground beneath our feet trembled violently. A deafening crack split the air and my eyes flew open. One of the monoliths had split down the middle, dark ichor oozing from the fissure. "No!" Mark cried, redoubling his efforts. Sweat poured down his face, his features contorted in concentration. But it was too late. The crack widened, spreading to the other stones. With a sound like reality itself tearing apart, the vortex exploded outward. We were thrown back, slamming into the tree line. As I struggled to my feet, my vision swimming, I saw something emerging from the rift. It was vast, its form shifting and changing so rapidly I couldn't focus on any one part. Tentacles, wings, eyes all appeared and disappeared in a nauseating display. "The barrier's down," Mark yelled, his voice filled with despair. "We need to fall back and regroup." We didn't need to be told twice. We ran, crashing through the underbrush, the sounds of pursuit close behind. Trees groaned and toppled, the very forest seeming to recoil from the abomination we'd unleashed. We burst out onto one of the main trails, nearly colliding with a group of hikers. Their eyes widened in shock at our disheveled appearance. "You need to evacuate immediately," I gasped, trying to catch my breath. "The park isn't safe." One of the hikers, a middle-aged woman, stepped forward. "What's going on? We heard strange noises." Her words were cut off by an unearthly shriek that echoed through the trees. The color drained from her face. "Go," Dave urged, already moving to guide the group toward the nearest exit. "We'll explain later, just get to safety." As the hikers hurried away, I turned to Mark. "What now? How do we stop that thing?" He shook his head, his expression grim. "We can't, not alone. We need to contact the other guardians, gather our strength. But first we need to buy some time." From his pack, he produced several small metallic objects that looked like a cross between a compass and a pocket watch. He handed one each to Dave and me. "These are anchors," he explained quickly. "They'll help reinforce what's left of the barrier, slow the entity's progress. We need to place them at key points around the park." "And then what?" Dave asked, turning the device over in his hands. Mark's eyes met ours, filled with a mixture of determination and fear. "Then we prepare for war. The old ones are awakening, and this is just the beginning." As if to emphasize his point, another roar shook the forest, closer this time. In the distance, we could hear the panicked shouts of park visitors and the wail of emergency sirens. "I'll take the north quadrant," Mark said. "Dave, you take east. Thad, west. Move fast. Stay alert. We'll rendezvous at the old fire tower in 3 hours." With a quick nod to each other, we split up. As I jogged down the familiar trail, now eerily empty, I couldn't help but marvel at how quickly everything had changed. This morning, my biggest concern had been filing my weekly report. Now I was racing against time to prevent an eldritch horror from fully entering our world. I reached the first location Mark had indicated, a small clearing dominated by an ancient, gnarled oak. Following his hasty instructions, I activated the anchor and buried it at the tree's base. As soon as it was in place, I felt a subtle shift in the air, like a barely perceptible tightening. 2 more locations to go. I picked up my pace, all too aware of the lengthening shadows as afternoon gave way to evening. The forest had never felt so menacing, every rustle and snap making me flinch. At the second site, a rocky outcropping overlooking a small stream, I encountered my first real obstacle. As I approached, a figure emerged from behind a boulder. It looked human at first glance, but its movements were all wrong, jerky and disjointed, like a marionette with tangled strings. It lunged at me with inhuman speed. I dodged, feeling the wind of its passage ruffle my hair. Rolling to my feet, I grabbed a fallen branch, holding it out like a club. The thing, I couldn't bring myself to call it a person, tilted its head at an impossible angle, regarding me with blank, pupilless eyes. Then its jaw unhinged, opening far wider than any human mouth should, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. I swung the branch as it charged again, connecting solidly with its head. There was a sickening crunch, and it dropped like a stone. But even as it fell, its flesh began to ripple and change, melting away to reveal something chitinous and insectoid underneath. Swallowing my revulsion, I quickly placed and activated the second anchor. 2 down, 1 to go. The final location was the trickiest, a small cave set into a hillside. As I approached, my flashlight beam playing over the rocky entrance, I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me not to enter, that only death and madness lay within those shadowy depths. But I knew I had no choice. Taking a deep breath, I ducked into the cave. The beam of my flashlight seemed feeble against the pressing darkness. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, the sound echoing off unseen walls. I moved cautiously, one hand trailing along the damp stone for guidance. Suddenly, my light fell upon a series of markings carved into the cave wall. They were similar to the symbols I'd seen on the monoliths, but older somehow, cruder. As I traced them with my fingers, a jolt of energy surged through me, and for a moment I saw vast cyclopean cities beneath an alien sky, creatures of impossible geometry, their very existence an affront to sanity, a war that raged across dimensions, with Earth as just one battlefield among many. I jerked my hand back, gasping. The visions faded, leaving me disoriented and nauseous. Shaking my head to clear it, I fumbled for the final anchor. As I activated it, the symbols on the wall flared to life, pulsing with an eerie, eldritch light. My task complete, I turned to leave, and found my exit blocked. Standing in the mouth of the cave was a figure that could have stepped out of humanity's most primal nightmares. It was vaguely humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong, its limbs too long and jointed in impossible ways. Its skin writhed as if alive, and where its face should have been was a mass of writhing tentacles. I backed away, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The creature advanced, its movements fluid and predatory. I was cornered with nowhere to run. Just as I thought it was over, a piercing whistle cut through the air. The creature recoiled, its tentacles whipping about in obvious distress. A moment later, Dave burst into the cave, wielding what looked like a flare gun. "Down," he shouted, and I dropped to the ground without hesitation. There was a deafening bang, and a blinding light filled the cave. The creature shrieked, a sound that would haunt my nightmares for years to come, and when my vision cleared, it was gone. Dave helped me to my feet, his face pale but determined. "You okay?" I nodded, still too shaken to speak. "Come on," he said, tugging me towards the exit. "Mark's waiting. We've got a lot to talk about." As we emerged from the cave into the gathering dusk, I looked back at the innocuous hillside. How long had that thing been waiting there? How many other horrors lurked just beneath the surface of our world, biding their time? One thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The veil had been lifted, and there was no going back. As Dave and I made our way to the rendezvous point, I steeled myself for whatever came next. After all, someone had to stand against the darkness. Why not us? As Dave and I approached the old fire tower, the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep purples and oranges. The forest around us seemed to hold its breath, as if aware of the cosmic shift that had occurred. The once familiar sounds of wildlife were eerily absent, replaced by an oppressive silence that made every snapping twig sound like a gunshot. Mark was already there, pacing at the base of the tower. His clothes were torn and dirty, and a nasty gash ran along his left cheek. When he saw us, relief washed over his face. "Thank God," he muttered. "I was starting to think." He trailed off, but we knew what he meant. In the span of a few hours, our world had become a place where not making it back was a very real possibility. "Did you set the anchors?" Mark asked, all business now. We nodded, and I couldn't help but notice how Dave's hand trembled slightly as he handed over his device. The encounter in the cave had shaken us both more than we cared to admit. "Good," Mark said. "It's not a permanent solution, but it should slow the incursion. Buy us some time to prepare." "Prepare for what exactly?" I asked, the events of the day finally catching up to me. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving me feeling drained and more than a little scared. "Mark, what the hell is going on? What were those things?" Mark sighed, suddenly looking every bit his 50-plus years. "It's a long story, and we don't have time for all of it right now. The short version, there are entities, for lack of a better term, ancient beings that existed long before humans, with power beyond our comprehension. Some call them gods, others demons. The truth is, we don't really know what they are. And they're waking up," Dave said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mark nodded grimly. "They've been dormant for millennia, sealed away by forces we barely understand. But the seals are weakening. What you saw today, that was just the beginning." A chill ran down my spine as I remembered the writhing mass of tentacles and eyes that had emerged from the rift. If that was just the beginning. "So what do we do?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "We fight," Mark said simply. "There's an organization, the Order of the Eternal Vigil. We've been standing guard against these threats for thousands of years. I'm a member, as was my father before me, and his father before him." "And now us?" Dave asked, a hint of skepticism in his tone. Mark shook his head. "It's not that simple. Joining the Order is a lifelong commitment. It's dangerous, often thankless work. Many don't survive their first year. I won't lie to you. If you choose this path, your lives as you knew them are over." A heavy silence fell over us. In the distance, an owl hooted, the sound jarringly normal in the face of everything we'd experienced. "What's the alternative?" I finally asked. "You walk away," Mark said. "We have methods, ways of making people forget what they've seen. You could go back to your normal lives, blissfully unaware of the horrors that lurk in the shadows." Part of me was tempted to forget the terror, the bone-deep wrongness of the creatures we'd encountered, to go back to simple patrols and campfire safety talks. But then I thought of the hikers we'd evacuated, of all the people who came to the park seeking peace and beauty. They had no idea of the danger they were in. "I'm in," I said, surprising myself with the conviction in my voice. "Someone has to stand against this. Might as well be us." Dave nodded slowly. "Me too. I don't think I could live with myself if I walked away now." Mark smiled, but it was a sad expression. "I was afraid you'd say that, but I'm glad you did. We need all the help we can get." From his pack he produced an ancient-looking leather-bound book and a small wooden box. "These contain the basic knowledge you'll need to get started. Wards, protective sigils, that sort of thing. Study them carefully. Your lives may depend on it." As I took the book, its weight seemed to represent the burden of knowledge we were taking on. There would be no going back from this moment. "So what's our next move?" Dave asked, thumbing through the pages of his own book with a mix of fascination and trepidation. Mark's expression turned grim. "We need to secure the park. There are other sites like the one you saw today, weak points where the veil between worlds is thin. We need to reinforce them all before—" He was cut off by a bone-shaking roar that echoed through the forest. It was followed by another, then another, each from a different direction. "Too late," Mark whispered, his face pale in the fading light. "They're coming through." As if on cue, the radio at Mark's belt crackled to life. "This is Ranger Station 1, a panicked voice called out. "We're under attack. Some kind of, I don't know what they are. We need immediate backup." Mark grabbed the radio. "This is Supervisor Collins. Evacuate immediately. Do not engage. I repeat, do not engage." But the only response was static, punctuated by screams and sounds of destruction. We have to help them, I said, already moving towards the tower stairs. From the top, we'd have a better view of what we were dealing with. Mark caught my arm. Thad, wait. We're not equipped for this. We need to fall back, regroup. Another roar cut him off, this one close enough to shake the ground beneath our feet. In the gathering darkness, I saw movement among the trees, large shapes moving with a speed that belied their size. No time, Dave said, drawing his service pistol. It looked pitifully inadequate against whatever was coming, but it was all we had. Mark cursed under his breath, then nodded. All right, but stay close and for God's sake be careful. If you see something you can't handle, you run, understood? We nodded, and as one we turned to face the encroaching darkness. The sounds of combat echoed from the direction of the ranger station, mixed with otherworldly shrieks that set my teeth on edge. As we moved through the shadowy forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into something far bigger than we could handle. But what choice did we have? We were the only line of defense between these horrors and an unsuspecting world. Just another day in the park? Not by a long shot. But then again, I'd always known the wilderness held more secrets than most people realized. I just never imagined I'd be the one to face them head on. Whatever came next, one thing was certain. Our lives would never be the same again. The old ones were waking, and we were all that stood in their way. God help us all. The forest, once a sanctuary of peace and natural beauty, had transformed into a nightmarish battleground. As we made our way towards the ranger station, the very air seemed to thicken, making each breath a struggle. The trees loomed overhead, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, casting deep shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Stay alert, Mark whispered, his eyes constantly scanning our surroundings. These entities can take many forms. Don't trust anything you see. No sooner had the words left his mouth than a blood-curdling scream pierced the night. It was coming from just ahead, beyond a dense thicket of undergrowth. We exchanged glances, then moved forward cautiously, weapons at the ready. As we pushed through the bushes, we came upon a clearing bathed in an unnatural, sickly green light. In the center stood what I first took to be a person, one of the park rangers, judging by the tattered uniform. But as it turned to face us, my blood ran cold. Its face was a writhing mass of tentacles, pulsing and squirming in a grotesque parody of human features. Where its eyes should have been, there were only empty weeping sockets, and yet somehow I knew it could see us. Oh God, Dave choked out beside me, his face pale with shock. The thing that had once been a ranger let out another piercing shriek and lurched towards us with inhuman speed. Mark reacted first, raising his hand and shouting words in that strange, guttural language I'd heard him use before. A shimmering barrier sprang into existence between us and the creature, causing it to recoil with a hiss of pain. "The sigils!" Mark yelled. "Use the sigils I showed you." With trembling hands, I fumbled for the book he'd given me earlier. My mind raced, trying to recall the symbols I'd barely had time to glance at. Finding the page, I traced the pattern in the air with my fingers, focusing all my will into the gesture. To my amazement, lines of blue fire followed my movements, hanging in the air for a moment before shooting towards the creature. They wrapped around it like chains, causing it to writhe and screech in agony. Dave followed suit, his own sigil joining mine. The combined power of our inexperienced attempts and Mark's more practiced magic seemed to be too much for the entity. With a final ear-splitting shriek, it collapsed to the ground, its form dissolving into a puddle of noxious ichor. We stood there, panting and shaken, staring at the spot where the creature had been. What was that?" I managed to ask between ragged breaths. Mark's face was grim. That was one of our own, corrupted by the influence of the old ones. It's what happens when humans are exposed to their power for too long. The implications of his words hit me like a physical blow. That thing had once been a person, someone like us. How long before we met the same fate? As if reading my thoughts, Mark placed a hand on my shoulder. "That's why the training is so important. The wards and sigils don't just protect us from external threats, they shield our minds from the corrupting influence." A distant explosion rocked the ground, reminding us that we didn't have time to dwell on what we'd just witnessed. The sounds of combat were growing closer, punctuated by inhuman roars and the occasional burst of gunfire. "We need to move," Dave said, his voice steadier now. "The station." His words were cut off by a deafening crack, like thunder directly overhead. The sky, already dark with night, seemed to split open. Through the rift I caught glimpses of a realm that defied description. Impossible geometries, colors that hurt to look at, and vast, unknowable shapes moving in the distance. "No," Mark breathed, his face ashen. "It's happening too fast. The barriers are collapsing." As we watched in horror, things began to emerge from the rift. Some were vaguely humanoid, others defied any earthly classification. They poured into our world like a flood of nightmares made flesh. "Fall back," Mark shouted, already turning to run. "We can't fight them all." We fled through the forest, branches whipping at our faces, roots seeming to reach up to trip us. Behind us, the sounds of pursuit grew closer, chittering, slithering noises that sent shivers down my spine. As we burst out of the tree line onto one of the main park roads, we saw that the invasion wasn't limited to our section of the forest. All around us, rifts were opening, spilling more horrors into our world. The sky was alight with unnatural auroras, and in the distance I could see the glow of fires. "The evacuation point," Dave gasped, pointing down the road. "We set it up at the visitor center. There might still be people there." Mark nodded grimly. "It's our best chance. If we can gather enough survivors, maybe we can mount a defense." As we ran towards what we hoped would be safety, I couldn't help but think about how quickly everything had changed. This morning I was just a park ranger, worried about littering and campfire safety. Now I was running for my life from cosmic horrors, desperately trying to remember magical symbols that might save me from a fate worse than death. The visitor center loomed ahead, a beacon of normalcy in a world gone mad. But as we drew closer, my heart sank. The parking lot was a scene of chaos. Overturned vehicles, broken glass, and signs of a panicked evacuation. And moving among the wreckage were shapes that had no right to exist in our reality. We skidded to a halt, taking in the nightmarish tableau before us. Dave raised his gun, though we all knew it would be useless against most of these entities. Mark began tracing complex patterns in the air, muttering under his breath. As for me, I gripped the book of sigils tightly, my mind racing through the limited knowledge I'd gained. Whatever came next, I knew we were in for the fight of our lives. Just another day in the park, not even close. But as I stood there facing the unimaginable with my friends by my side, I realized something. This was what I was meant to do, to stand as a guardian between our world and the horrors that lurked beyond. Let them come, we would be ready. The scene before us at the visitor center was pure chaos. Overturned vehicles littered the parking lot, their alarms blaring uselessly into the night. Shattered glass crunched under our feet as we cautiously approached, eyes darting from shadow to shadow, searching for threats. "Look," Dave whispered, pointing to a group of people huddled near the entrance. They were a mix of park visitors and staff, terror etched on their faces as they watched us approach. As we drew closer, I recognized one of the park rangers, Karen, a seasoned veteran who'd shown me the ropes when I first started. Her uniform was torn and bloodied, and she clutched a makeshift weapon, a broken-off car antenna, in her trembling hands. "Mark, Thad, Dave," she called out, disbelief and relief warring in her voice. "Thank God, we thought everyone else was—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. I couldn't blame her. The horrors we'd witnessed in the past few hours were enough to break anyone. Mark stepped forward, his voice steady and authoritative. "We need to get these people to safety. Is there anyone else inside?" Karen nodded. "A few. Some are injured. We've been holding out, but those things, they keep coming." As if on cue, an inhuman shriek split the air. From around the corner of the building, a creature emerged. It was vaguely humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong. Limbs too long, joints bending in impossible ways. Its skin writhed as if alive, and where its face should have been was a mass of writhing tentacles. The survivors screamed, some frozen in terror, others scrambling to get away. Dave raised his gun, but Mark pushed it down. "Save your bullets," he growled. "They won't do much good here." Instead, he began tracing complex patterns in the air, his voice rising in that strange, guttural language I was beginning to recognize as the language of power. The air around us shimmered, and I felt a wave of force push outward. The creature recoiled as if struck, its tentacles whipping about in obvious distress. But it wasn't enough to stop it. It lurched forward again, this time joined by two more of its kind. "Thad, Dave!" Mark shouted. "The sigils, now!" I fumbled with the book, my hands shaking as I tried to find the right page. Beside me, Dave was doing the same. We began tracing the symbols we'd barely had time to study, our movements clumsy but fueled by desperate determination. To my amazement, lines of blue fire followed our gestures, hanging in the air for a moment before shooting towards the creatures. They writhed and screeched as the magical energy enveloped them, their forms seeming to waver and distort. But it wasn't enough. More were coming, drawn by the commotion. I could see shapes moving in the shadows, hear the scrape of claws on asphalt, and the slither of things best left unimagined. "Inside!" Mark ordered. "We need to fortify our position." We herded the survivors into the visitor center, Dave and I bringing up the rear, our fingers aching from constantly tracing sigils to keep the encroaching horrors at bay. Mark slammed the doors shut behind us, quickly sketching a complex ward on the glass. "That should hold them. For a while," he panted, sweat beading on his brow. I looked around the room. About 24 people were crammed into the space, a mix of terrified tourists and shell-shocked park staff. Some were injured, others simply in shock. All of them looked to us with a desperate hope that made my heart ache. "What now?" I asked Mark, keeping my voice low. He ran a hand through his hair, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for inspiration. "We need to contact the Order. They'll have resources, reinforcements, but with all the electromagnetic interference from the rifts, I don't know if we can get a signal out." "The radio tower," Karen spoke up. She'd been listening to our conversation, her expression grim but determined. "On top of Miners Ridge. If we can get there, we might be able to boost a signal enough to punch through." Mark nodded slowly. "It's risky, but it might be our only shot." "I'll go," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. Dave stepped up beside me. "Me too." Mark looked between us, conflict clear on his face. "It's dangerous. The forest will be crawling with those things, and you've barely had any training." "Do we have a choice?" I countered. "You need to stay here, protect these people. Dave and I are the only ones who can make the trip." After a long moment, Mark nodded. "All right, but you'll need some extra protection." He reached into his pack and pulled out 2 small, intricately carved stones. "Carry these with you. They're imbued with protective magic. They won't stop everything, but they might give you an edge." As Dave and I prepared to leave, gathering what supplies we could, I couldn't help but marvel at how quickly our world had changed. Just this morning I was worried about filing reports and checking trail markers. Now I was about to embark on a desperate mission through a forest infested with cosmic horrors, armed with nothing but a book of magical symbols and an enchanted rock. But as I looked around at the frightened faces of the survivors, I knew we had no choice. We were their only hope. As we prepared to step back out into the nightmare our world had become, Dave caught my eye. "You ready for this?" I managed a grim smile. "Ready as I'll ever be. Just another day in the park, right?" He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Yeah, just another day." With one last look at the huddled survivors, we pushed open the door and stepped out into the chaos. The night was alive with unnatural sounds and sights, the very air seeming to pulse with malevolent energy. But we had a mission, and come hell or high water, or in this case, eldritch abominations from beyond the veil of reality, we were going to see it through. After all, someone had to stand against the darkness. Why not us? The moment we stepped outside, the full weight of our situation hit us. The night air was thick with an acrid, sulphurous smell that burned our nostrils. In the distance, we could see the eerie glow of fires scattered throughout the park, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. "Miners Ridge is about 5 miles northeast of here," Dave whispered, his eyes constantly scanning our surroundings. "In normal conditions, it'd be a straightforward hike." I nodded grimly. "But these aren't normal conditions." We set off at a brisk pace, sticking to the shadows as much as possible. The familiar trails of the park had become a twisted labyrinth of danger. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every snapping twig made us freeze, our hearts pounding. About a mile into our journey, we encountered our first major obstacle. The trail ahead was blocked by what looked like a wall of writhing darkness. As we watched, shapes formed and dissolved within it, faces contorted in agony, clawed hands reaching out, only to melt back into the roiling mass. "Any ideas?" Dave asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I flipped through the book of sigils, my hands shaking slightly. "There's something here about dispelling illusions. Maybe." I traced the symbol in the air, focusing all my will into the gesture. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like tearing fabric, the wall of darkness shredded apart, revealing the path beyond. "Nice work," Dave said, clapping me on the shoulder. But our victory was short-lived. As we pressed on, the very landscape seemed to shift and change around us. Trees twisted into impossible shapes, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. The ground beneath our feet sometimes felt solid, other times like we were walking on sponge. At one point, we found ourselves in a clearing that defied all laws of physics. The sky above was a swirling vortex of colors that hurt to look at directly. Floating islands of earth hung suspended in the air, some right side up, others inverted. "We must have stumbled into a pocket dimension," I said, recalling something I'd read in the book. "The barriers between realities are breaking down." Dave swallowed hard. "How do we get out?" I was about to admit I had no idea when I spotted something. On one of the floating islands, there was a door standing alone, not attached to any structure. It looked painfully ordinary, a simple wooden door you might find in any home. "There," I pointed. "I think that's our way out." Getting to the door was a harrowing experience. We had to jump from island to island, the laws of gravity seeming to change with each leap. Several times we nearly fell into the void between the fragments of reality. Finally, we reached the door. With a shared look of determination, we opened it and stepped through. We found ourselves back in the familiar forest, but miles from where we'd entered the pocket dimension. The radio tower loomed ahead, so close, yet still so far. As we approached the base of the ridge, a bone-chilling howl split the air. From the shadows emerged a pack of what I can only describe as hellhounds. They were massive, easily the size of bears, with glowing red eyes and slavering jaws that dripped a caustic fluid that sizzled when it hit the ground. "Run!" Dave yelled, already sprinting towards the tower. We raced up the ridge, the monstrous dogs hot on our heels. I could feel their hot breath on the back of my legs, spurring me to push harder, run faster than I ever had before. The tower loomed above us, a metallic skeleton reaching into the chaotic sky. As we neared the base, I saw our chance. "The maintenance ladder!" I gasped out between breaths. "They can't climb!" We reached the ladder just as the lead hound lunged. I felt white-hot pain as its claws raked across my calf, but adrenaline kept me moving. We scrambled up the ladder, not stopping until we'd climbed several stories. Looking down, we saw the hellhounds circling the base of the tower, their otherworldly howls echoing into the night. But we were safe, for the moment. "You okay?" Dave asked, eyeing the bloody tear in my pants leg. I nodded, though the pain was starting to make itself known now that the immediate danger had passed. "I'll live, let's just get this done." We climbed to the top of the tower where the radio equipment was housed. Dave, who had more technical knowledge than me, began working on the transmitter while I kept watch. From our vantage point, I could see the full extent of the chaos that had engulfed the park. Rifts in reality dotted the landscape, spewing forth creatures and energies that had no place in our world. In the distance, I could see the visitor center, a faint shimmer around it indicating that Mark's wards were still holding. "I think I've got it," Dave called out. "Help me with this." Together, we recorded a message detailing our situation and begging for help. As we prepared to transmit, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A massive shape was moving through the forest, heading straight for the visitor center. It was hard to make out details at this distance, but it was bigger than anything I'd seen yet. "Dave," I said, my voice tight, "we need to hurry." He nodded, understanding the urgency in my tone. With a final adjustment, he hit the transmit button. The radio crackled to life, our message beaming out into the ether. Now all we could do was hope that someone was listening. As we began our descent, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were racing against time. The entity moving towards the visitor center filled me with a dread I couldn't explain. Whatever it was, I knew instinctively that it was bad news. We had done what we came to do. Now we had to get back and warn the others. The real battle, I feared, was just beginning. As Dave and I raced back through the nightmare landscape of the park, the feeling of dread grew stronger with each step. The massive shape we'd seen from the tower loomed large in my mind, driving us forward despite our exhaustion and injuries. We encountered fewer creatures on our return journey, but the ones we did see seemed more grotesque, more powerful. It was as if the longer the barriers between worlds remained broken, the stronger and more numerous the invading horrors became. When we finally reached the visitor center, we were met with a scene of barely contained chaos. Mark's wards were still holding, but they flickered and wavered like a candle in the wind. The survivors inside looked even more haggard and terrified than when we'd left. "Did you make contact?" Mark asked as soon as we burst through the door. Dave nodded, trying to catch his breath. "Message sent, but we've got bigger problems." I quickly filled Mark in on what we'd seen from the tower. His face grew graver with each word. "An elder one," he muttered almost to himself. "It's worse than I thought." Before he could elaborate, the ground began to shake. A deep, resonant sound filled the air, more felt than heard. It was as if the very fabric of reality was groaning under some immense pressure. Through the windows, we saw it approach. The massive entity we'd spotted from the tower was even more terrifying up close. It towered over the trees, its form constantly shifting and changing. One moment it seemed vaguely humanoid, the next it was a writhing mass of tentacles and eyes. Looking at it directly made my head spin and my stomach churn. "What do we do?" Karen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark's face was set in grim determination. "We fight. It's all we can do." He turned to Dave and me. "You two have shown remarkable aptitude with the sigils. I need you to channel every ounce of power you can muster. Focus on containment and banishment." To the other park rangers, he gave quick instructions on setting up a perimeter and protecting the civilians. Then he turned back to the approaching monstrosity, his hands already moving in complex patterns. As the Elder One drew near, the very air seemed to warp and twist. Reality itself bent around the creature, creating a nightmarish landscape of impossible geometries and colors that shouldn't exist. Mark began to chant, his voice rising above the cacophony of terror and destruction. Dave and I joined in, our voices harmonizing with his in a language we somehow understood, despite never having learned. Power flowed through us, raw and primal. I felt connected to something vast and ancient, a wellspring of energy that both terrified and exhilarated me. The Elder One reacted to our magic, its form rippling and distorting even more wildly. It lashed out with appendages that defied description, smashing through trees and rocks as if they were made of paper. We poured everything we had into the spell, drawing sigils of containment and banishment in the air, with fingers trailing blue fire. A shimmering dome of energy began to form around the creature, pushing it back, constraining its impossible form. But it wasn't enough. The Elder One fought against our magic with a strength that seemed limitless. Cracks appeared in our mystical barrier, widening with each passing second. Just when it seemed our efforts would fail, when the weight of cosmic horror threatened to crush us all, something changed. A new voice joined our chant, then another and another. I risked a glance behind us and saw the survivors, led by Karen, tracing sigils in the air. They moved clumsily, uncertainty clear on their faces. But their will was strong. Their efforts bolstered our own, the barrier strengthening and solidifying. The Elder One writhed and thrashed, its unearthly screech shaking the very ground beneath our feet. With a final desperate push, we completed the spell. There was a moment of absolute silence, as if the entire universe held its breath. Then, with a sound like reality itself tearing apart, a rift opened behind the Elder One. Tendrils of energy wrapped around the creature, dragging it back towards the portal. It fought, lashing out in all directions, but the pull was inexorable. In its final moments before being sucked through, it fixed us with a gaze from a multitude of eyes. In that look I saw eons of malevolence, of hunger, and of rage. Then it was gone, the rift sealing behind it with a thunderous boom. For a moment no one moved. The sudden silence was deafening after the chaos of battle. Then, slowly, cheers and sobs of relief began to rise from the gathered survivors. As the adrenaline wore off, I felt a bone-deep exhaustion settle over me. Looking at Dave and Mark, I could see they felt the same. Is it over? Dave asked, his voice hoarse from chanting. Mark shook his head slowly. No, not over. But we've won a significant victory here today. We've bought ourselves time. In the days that followed, we learned the true scope of what had happened. The incursion hadn't been limited to our park. Similar events had occurred all over the world, some contained, others not so much. The Order of the Eternal Vigil, the organization Mark had spoken of, arrived in force. They brought with them knowledge, resources, and a grim determination to push back the darkness. Dave and I were officially inducted into the order. Our lives as simple park rangers were over. Now we were soldiers in a secret war, guardians standing between our world and horrors beyond imagination. As we stood on the ridge overlooking the park, now cordoned off as a disaster area, I couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed. The world seemed both larger and smaller now. Larger because I knew of the vast, terrifying realities that existed beyond our own. Smaller because I understood how fragile our existence truly was, how thin the barrier that protected us. You ready for this? Dave asked, echoing his question from what felt like a lifetime ago. I looked out at the forest, still bearing the scars of our battle but slowly healing. Beyond it lay a world that had no idea how close it had come to ending, and all the battles yet to come. Ready as I'll ever be, I replied with a grim smile. Just another day in the park, right? Dave chuckled, and this time there was a hint of genuine humor in it. Yeah, just another day. As we turned to join the other members of the order, I knew that our greatest challenges still lay ahead. The old ones were stirring, and this had been just the first skirmish in a war that had raged since the dawn of time. But we would be ready. We had to be. After all, someone had to stand against the darkness. Why not us? In the 1980s, childhood had a different texture than it does today. We didn't have smartphones, tablets, or endless streaming services to fill our hours. Instead, our entertainment sprouted from imagination and adventure, particularly for those of us fortunate enough to grow up in small towns where the boundary between civilization and wilderness was delightfully blurry. Our parents' constant refrain of "go outside and play" wasn't a punishment, but an invitation to endless possibilities. In our community, like many similar rural American towns of that era, the culture revolved heavily around outdoor activities, hunting, fishing, and especially motorized recreation. Almost every kid had some form of ATV or dirt bike, the mechanical horses of our generation. These weren't just vehicles, they were passports to adventure, keys to a kingdom of dirt trails and forgotten places that adults rarely ventured. My own initiation into this world came at age 7, through a chance encounter with destiny in the form of a Yamaha YZ80 dirt bike. I still remember the moment perfectly, the bike propped up on its stand along the highway, gleaming in the summer sun like some mechanical promise of adventure. It was a racing bike, all power and purpose, far more machine than any 7-year-old should probably handle. But in that moment, I was consumed by the kind of pure, focused desire that only children can truly experience. My father, being the voice of reason and responsibility, initially resisted. He saw what I couldn't, or wouldn't, acknowledge, that a high-powered racing bike might be a bit much for a child who still needed help tying his shoes. But I launched a campaign of persuasion that would have made professional lobbyists proud. For weeks I worked every angle, employed every tactic in the child's arsenal of convince, pleading, promising, bargaining, and the most effective weapon of all, persistent, unrelenting enthusiasm. When he finally relented, I experienced joy in its purest form. The reality of actually riding the bike, however, provided an immediate reality check. My first attempt at mastering this mechanical beast resulted in an impressive but unintentional wheelie, followed by an equally impressive flip that probably had my father mentally calculating emergency room costs. The bike and I both survived, though my father's confidence in his decision may have been slightly dented. Learning to ride became my obsession. Our town had no shortage of open spaces, and I spent every available moment practicing, falling, getting back up, and trying again. The process of mastering the machine was gradual but deeply satisfying. Each new skill acquired, clutch control, gear shifting, weight distribution, felt like unlocking a new level of freedom. As my confidence grew, so did my radius of exploration. Word spread among my friends, as news always does in small towns, and soon I was being introduced to an entire network of trails and riding spots I hadn't known existed. After school became synonymous with dirt bike time, we'd rush home, grab our gear, and disappear into the network of trails that surrounded our town like a web. These weren't just afternoon activities, they were the building blocks of lifelong memories, the kind that get burnished golden with time. Among all our riding spots, one location held a particular mystique, Emmeline's. The name itself was a mystery. None of us knew who Emmeline was or had been, or why this particular stretch of wilderness bore her name. At its center stood an abandoned house, a structure that had been slowly returning to the earth for longer than anyone could remember. The house wasn't just a landmark. It was the heart of an elaborate network of trails that offered everything a young rider could want. Challenging hills that tested your nerve, creek crossings that required precise timing, and long straightaways where you could really open up the throttle and feel the rush of speed. The trails around Emmeline's had a different character than the other riding spots in our area. They felt older somehow, more established, as if they'd been carved into the landscape by something more ancient than dirt bikes and ATVs. The forest itself seemed different there, deeper, more watchful. Even during busy afternoons when multiple riders were tearing around the trails, there were always pockets of absolute silence, places where the normal sounds of the woods would suddenly cease. While I usually rode with friends, I'd done plenty of solo runs at Emmeline's. There was something special about riding alone, a purity to the experience that you couldn't get with others around. When you're by yourself on those trails, it's just you, the bike, and whatever lurks in the shadows between the trees. At least that's how I thought about it before that day. The afternoon in question started normally enough. School had loaded me down with homework that couldn't be ignored, forcing me to delay my usual after-school ride. By the time I'd finished my assignments and gotten permission to go out, the day was already sliding toward evening. It was summer, though, which meant I still had a good 2.5 hours before darkness would become an issue. My bike didn't have lights. None of our dirt bikes did. So timing was crucial. The late hour actually added to my anticipation. There's something different about the woods in the late afternoon when the sun starts to slip and the shadows begin to lengthen. The air gets heavier, carries sound differently. Even familiar trails take on new characteristics as the light changes and visibility starts to play tricks with your depth perception. I went through my usual pre-ride routine with practiced efficiency, checking the fuel, inspecting the chain tension, making sure everything was tight and ready. The bike had a minor issue, a broken clutch cable that my dad had ordered but hadn't arrived yet. This meant starting required a specific sequence: kickstart in neutral, give it a push, jump on, and throw it into gear. It wasn't ideal, but I'd gotten pretty good at the maneuver. Looking back now, I wonder if that mechanical limitation might have been what saved me, forcing me to become expert at quick starts. The 5-minute ride to Emmeline's was pure joy. There's nothing quite like the feeling of being on a dirt bike, especially at that age. The combination of freedom, power, and skill creates a kind of euphoria that's hard to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. The late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the trail, and the air had that perfect late summer quality, warm but not hot, with just enough moisture to keep the dust down. For the first hour, everything was normal. I had the trails to myself, which wasn't unusual for that time of day. Most kids would have already finished their riding and headed home for dinner. The solitude just made it better. No need to worry about other riders around blind corners, no pressure to show off or keep up with anyone else. Just me, the bike, and the increasingly shadowy trails. It was during a break in my riding that the first hints of something wrong began to surface. I'd been pushing hard for about an hour, taking the jumps higher and the corners faster than I probably should have when nature called. I found myself near the old field, a clearing roughly 4 or 5 acres in size, surrounded by an ancient fence that had been slowly losing its battle with time and rust for decades. The fence posts still stood like sentinels around the perimeter, though many of the connecting sections had long since surrendered to gravity and decay. Without my bike's kickstand, a racing bike sacrifice, I had to lean it carefully against one of the sturdier fence posts. The metal was cool against my hand, with that particular texture that only years of weathering can create. As I took care of business, the first unsettling detail registered in my consciousness: the absolute silence. Now, woods are never truly silent. There's always a baseline of sound. Birds calling, squirrels chittering, leaves rustling, the distant sound of water if you're near a creek. Even insects provide a constant background hum during summer months. But at that moment, standing there in the growing shadows of late afternoon, there was nothing. The silence had a weight to it, a presence that seemed to press against my eardrums. Initially, I rationalized it. I'd been riding hard after all, and the YZ80's two-stroke engine wasn't exactly quiet. It made sense that the local wildlife might need a few minutes to resume their normal activities after the noise had stopped. But as the seconds ticked by and the silence persisted, that explanation began to feel increasingly hollow. The first sound that broke through that unnatural quiet came from about 50 or 60 yards away, a rustling in the underbrush that seemed somehow deliberate. When I looked in that direction, I saw nothing obvious, but something about the way the shadows moved between the trees seemed wrong. The rational part of my brain immediately suggested a squirrel. They were everywhere in these woods after all, but squirrels don't make shadows move like that. That's when the sensation of being watched hit me. It wasn't the vague paranoia you sometimes get in the woods when your imagination starts working overtime. This was visceral, primal, the same instinct that tells prey animals when a predator has fixed its attention on them. The feeling had a direction to it, as if I could have pointed to exactly where the watching thing was, even though I couldn't see it. The heavy knowledge of my vulnerability settled over me like a wet blanket. I was alone, at least a mile from the nearest house, with only a dirt bike that required a complicated starting procedure to escape on. The sun was getting lower, creating longer shadows between the trees, and that watching presence seemed to be growing stronger with each passing moment. As I started to move toward my bike, every childhood story about monsters in the woods suddenly felt less like fiction and more like warning. That's when I heard it, the sound that would haunt my dreams for years to come: footsteps, perfectly matching my own, coming from directly behind me. The human mind has an incredible capacity for denial, especially when faced with something that shouldn't be possible. Those footsteps behind me, perfect mirrors of my own movements, triggered a rapid cascade of rationalizations. It had to be an echo, I told myself, or maybe the sound of my own footsteps bouncing off the old fence, or one of my friends playing a prank. The alternative was too terrifying to contemplate, but each step I took was shadowed by another, and the sound wasn't coming from the fence or the trees or any angle that could have produced an echo. It was coming from directly behind me, close enough that I should have felt breath on my neck, should have seen a shadow overlapping my own in the fading sunlight. When I spun around, expecting, hoping to catch one of my friends in the act of an elaborate prank, I found only empty air and lengthening shadows. The rational explanations crumbled away like dry leaves, leaving me alone with a truth my mind wasn't ready to accept. Something was there, something I couldn't see but could hear with terrifying clarity. Each step I took toward my bike was accompanied by that phantom footfall, and now I could hear something else in those steps, a weight that suggested something far larger than a human, and a subtle wrongness to the rhythm that spoke of a gait that wasn't quite natural. The distance to my bike couldn't have been more than 10 feet, but it felt like miles. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew I couldn't waste the precious seconds I'd need to execute the complicated starting procedure. Without a clutch cable, I'd have to perform a precise sequence of actions: kickstart the engine, get it moving, jump on, and shift into gear, all while whatever was behind me closed the distance. The next few moments exist in my memory with the hyper-real clarity that only pure terror can produce. I remember the exact texture of the rusted fence under my hands as I grabbed my bike, the way the fading sunlight caught the chrome of the handlebars, the smell of gasoline and oil mixed with the organic decay of the forest, and behind it all, those footsteps, still matching my movements with impossible precision. I took a deep breath, gathering every scrap of courage I possessed. All those hours of practice with the broken clutch cable were about to be put to the ultimate test. I had one chance to get this right. If I stalled the bike or missed the timing on jumping on, I knew instinctively that there wouldn't be a second attempt. The sequence of actions that followed felt like they happened in slow motion, though they couldn't have taken more than a few seconds. My hands found their positions automatically, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought was starting to freeze up with fear. The kickstart engaged with a solid thrust, the engine catching on the first try. Thank God for small mercies. As I began to push the bike forward, I felt something change in the air behind me, a shift in pressure, a gathering of intent. That's when I felt it, a rush of air across my back like something had swung or swiped at me and missed by inches. The sensation wasn't just physical, it carried with it an impression of massive size and predatory purpose that bypassed my conscious mind and spoke directly to the primitive brainstem where our oldest fears reside. What happened next was pure instinct and adrenaline. I threw myself onto the bike with a desperation I'd never known before, my body moving with a coordination that fear and survival instinct had somehow perfected. The engine roared as I slammed it into gear, the back tire throwing dirt and leaves as it fought for traction on the forest floor. For one heart-stopping moment, I thought the tire might spin uselessly, leaving me stranded there with whatever was behind me. But then the rubber caught, and the bike lurched forward with enough force to nearly throw me off. I rode like I'd never ridden before. Every skill I'd developed over countless hours of practice came together in a perfect symphony of survival. The bike responded to my slightest input as if it too sensed the danger behind us. I took corners at speeds that should have sent me crashing into the trees, leaned into turns at angles that defied gravity, and somehow stayed upright through it all. Behind me, the forest seemed to come alive with movement. When I dared to glance back, something every instinct screamed against doing. I could see the trees swaying and shaking, as if something massive was moving through them. Whatever was pursuing me wasn't constrained by the trails. It was coming straight through the forest, taking the most direct route possible. The sound of breaking branches and the impossible rhythm of its movement created a terrible soundtrack to my desperate flight. The YZ-80's engine screamed at a pitch I'd never heard before, as if the little bike understood that this wasn't just another afternoon ride. Each gear shift was perfect, each line through the corners exactingly precise. I rode like a professional, like my life depended on it, because I was absolutely certain that it did. The most terrifying part wasn't the speed or the danger of crashing. It was the growing certainty that whatever was chasing me was keeping pace. Despite pushing the bike to its absolute limits, despite taking risks that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances, I could still hear it moving through the forest parallel to my path. The thing seemed to anticipate my route, cutting across loops in the trail to match my progress. When I finally broke out onto the main road, the transition from dirt to pavement felt like crossing some kind of boundary. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, my whole body trembling with adrenaline and exertion. The sudden silence was almost as shocking as the chase had been. The normal sounds of the world, distant traffic, birds, the wind in the trees, seemed to rush back in all at once as if someone had suddenly unmuted reality. Just as I was starting to think I might have imagined the whole thing, it came. A scream that started so low it was almost subsonic, building to a pitch that made my bones vibrate. It wasn't just loud, it was wrong in a way that defied description, like the sound of something that shouldn't exist in our world, trying to express itself through sound waves that weren't meant to carry such information. The scream seemed to go on forever, building in intensity until I could feel it in my chest cavity, like it was trying to reach inside me and stop my heart. When it finally ended, the normal sounds of the world seemed flat and artificial in comparison, as if that otherworldly cry had somehow changed the way my ears process sound. I kicked the bike into gear and rode home as fast as I dared on the pavement, convinced that every shadow concealed whatever had chased me through Emmeline's woods. The bike that had been my pride and joy, my ticket to adventure, suddenly felt fragile and inadequate against the memory of what lurked in those trees. It would be months before I ventured back to Emmeline's, and when I did, I made sure I was never alone. The broken clutch cable was fixed, but I kept practicing those quick starts anyway, a habit born of terror that never quite left me. When my friends asked why I insisted on riding in groups, I made excuses about safety in numbers and parents' rules. How could I explain what I'd encountered? Who would believe that something had stalked me through those familiar woods, matching my steps with impossible precision before pursuing me with inhuman speed? To this day, I can't pass those trails without remembering that unearthly scream, without feeling the phantom rush of air across my back where something nearly caught me. The woods hold their secrets, and sometimes, if we're lucky, they let us escape with ours. But the memory of that day lingers like a shadow, a reminder that not all childhood adventures end with just a good story to tell. Life in rural southern Louisiana shapes you in ways that outsiders rarely understand. I was 23 when it happened, old enough to know better but still young enough to chase midnight adventures. Growing up here teaches you things they don't put in books. Lessons written in muddy footprints and whispered warnings. Here, where land and water blur together, the boundary between civilization and wilderness is more suggestion than fact. Nature isn't something you visit. It's something you negotiate with daily. The mosquitoes are a constant presence, their hunger as reliable as the tides. We joke that they're our state bird, but there's truth hidden in that humor. Snakes and alligators are simply part of life's backdrop, like mailboxes or stop signs in other places. Everyone here has their stories. The uncle who survived a water moccasin bite, the neighbor who lost a dog to a gator, the cousin who swears they saw something in the swamp that defied explanation. These stories aren't told to frighten, they're passed down as survival knowledge, a verbal map of the dangers that share our world. But what happened that July night was different from our usual bayou encounters. It wasn't about the familiar dangers, the scaled predators that sun themselves on logs, or the venomous serpents that make their homes in our waters. This was something else entirely. Something that the old tales whisper about but modern minds reject. A rougarou, or at least that's what I've come to believe it was. The evening started innocently enough. My girlfriend and I were out for a drive, one of those aimless cruises that young people take when the night feels too beautiful to waste indoors. We weren't looking for trouble or adventure, just some time together away from the usual routines and familiar faces. The night was showing off its finest features. A full moon hanging low and heavy in the sky, stars scattered across the darkness like diamond dust, their light unusually bright away from town's modest glow. Something about the beauty of the night drew us to stop beside one of the countless bayou areas that punctuate our landscape. The spot was picturesque in that distinctly Louisiana way, cypress trees rising from the dark water like ancient guardians, their knees breaking the surface like the spines of sleeping monsters. Spanish moss draped from the branches like gray ghosts, swaying slightly in the warm night air. For about half an hour we lived in one of those perfect moments that seem to exist outside of time. Sitting on the hood of my car, watching the moonlight dance on the water, we were just another couple stealing time together under the stars. The night air was thick with the usual symphony of frogs and crickets, the occasional splash of something moving in the water. It felt familiar, safe. Right up until it didn't. The first indication that something was wrong came through our ears rather than our eyes. The sound of movement, not the usual splashing of water or rustling of leaves, but something more deliberate, more purposeful. It was the kind of sound that makes the primitive part of your brain sit up and take notice, even before your conscious mind can process what's wrong. We strained our eyes trying to locate the source of the sound, our heads turning in slow, synchronized movements as we scanned the darkness. The moonlight, which had seemed so romantic moments before, now created deceptive shadows that seemed to move and shift among the cypress trees. After a couple of minutes, the sound ceased, and we tried to convince ourselves it was just the usual wildlife. Maybe a deer coming down to drink, or a raccoon prowling the shoreline. Growing up in Louisiana, you develop a certain comfort level with the sounds of nature. You learn to distinguish between the harmless rustle of a possum in the underbrush and the sinister glide of a cottonmouth through fallen leaves. This sound had been different, wrong somehow, in a way that was hard to articulate but impossible to ignore. Then we saw movement in the water. At first glance, it resembled the familiar sight of an alligator's approach, that subtle displacement of water, the barely visible ridge breaking the surface. It's something every Louisiana kid learns to recognize early, like identifying poison ivy or knowing when a storm's about to break. But something about this movement pattern wasn't quite right. It was too smooth, too calculated, as if whatever was causing it was thinking rather than just acting on instinct. The reasonable response would have been to immediately get in the car and leave. That's what generations of Bayou wisdom would have counseled. But there's something about youth that makes you hesitate, that makes you want to satisfy your curiosity, even when every instinct is screaming at you to run. So we stayed, watching the water, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. That's when it happened. The moment that would change our understanding of what's possible in this world. What we had assumed was an alligator raised its head from the water, and in the brilliant moonlight we saw something that shouldn't exist. Instead of the familiar elongated snout of a gator, we saw what appeared to be the head of a massive dog, but wrong somehow, larger than any canine had any right to be, with features that seemed to shift and change as we watched. I kept quiet at first, not wanting to alarm my girlfriend. It's funny how the mind works in moments like that. Even face to face with something impossible, you try to maintain normalcy, to protect others from the horror you're witnessing. But I could feel her tension, could sense that she was seeing the same thing I was, that this wasn't just a trick of light and shadow on the dark water. The drive home that night was charged with an electric kind of silence, both of us processing what we'd seen, but afraid to be the first to speak of it. When I finally pulled up to her house, she turned to me with an expression I'll never forget, a mixture of fear, confusion, and desperate need for confirmation that she hadn't imagined it all. "Did you?" she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you see something weird by the bayou earlier?" The relief in her eyes when I nodded was palpable. "That giant dog head in the water?" I asked, finally giving voice to what we'd both witnessed. Her rapid nodding confirmed it. We'd both seen the same impossible thing. The shared experience somehow made it both more real and more terrifying. It's one thing to think you've seen something supernatural. It's another entirely when someone else has seen it too. The encounter haunted us, becoming the subject of countless late-night conversations. We found ourselves obsessively discussing details we remembered differently or hadn't noticed in the moment. The way the water had seemed to curl around the creature rather than ripple naturally. How the moonlight had reflected in its fur with an almost metallic quality. The unnatural silence that had fallen over the bayou just before it appeared. A few weeks later, we took a day trip to New Orleans, partly to distract ourselves from the memory, partly drawn by the city's connection to the supernatural. As we walked down one of the French Quarter's narrow streets, discussing our experience for the 100th time, fate intervened in the form of an elderly man who overheard our conversation. He approached us with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what we were talking about. His first question sent chills down my spine. "Did it look like a giant dog?" The specificity of his query, the knowing look in his eyes, it was clear this wasn't just idle curiosity. When he asked about the color of its eyes, we realized we couldn't remember. That detail, which should have been so memorable, was strangely absent from both our recollections. His response was unsettling in its matter-of-factness. "Makes sense. Rougarou got all different eye colors, and sometimes they change while you're watching. Besides, when you see a werewolf-looking monster in the bayou, last thing you're thinking about is what color its eyes are." The casual way he dropped the word Rougarou into the conversation, as if we were discussing something as ordinary as the weather, made it somehow more real. Here was someone who not only believed us but seemed to have intimate knowledge of what we'd encountered. His parting words still echo in my mind. "Y'all are real lucky it wasn't hungry, or y'all would be gone." Then he simply walked away, disappearing into the crowd like some mystical messenger who had delivered his warning and fulfilled his purpose. Since that night, I've made several return trips to that same stretch of bayou, though never again so late, and never again during a full moon. Each visit feels different now, charged with a knowledge that changes how you see everything. The cypress trees that once seemed merely picturesque now look like sentinels, their twisted forms perhaps standing guard over secrets far older than human memory. The water's surface, once simply dark and mysterious, now seems like a veil between our world and something else. Louisiana's always been a place where the line between the natural and supernatural blurs, where old tales are treated less like fiction and more like survival guides passed down through generations. The Rougarou isn't just a story here. It's a presence that lives in the shadows of our consciousness, as real as the gators and snakes we grow up learning to avoid. I've started paying more attention to the old stories now, the ones told in hushed voices by grandparents who refuse to dismiss them as mere folklore. I've noticed patterns in when and where people report strange sightings, how they cluster around certain phases of the moon, certain areas of the bayou. The old man in New Orleans wasn't just sharing a supernatural tale, he was warning us about a reality that modern life tries to forget. That stretch of bayou still calls to me sometimes, especially on full moon nights when the stars are bright and the air is thick with possibility. But now I know better than to answer that call. Some places belong to creatures older than our understanding, and some knowledge comes with the price of forever changing how you see the world. The water still moves at night, disturbed by things both known and unknown. But now I know that not all ripples are made by alligators, and not all legends are just stories. In the depths of the Louisiana bayou, under the light of a full moon, sometimes the monsters from the old tales rise to remind us that we're not as far removed from the wild as we like to think. In the summer of 2002, when childhood still wrapped me in its protective innocence, my family made a decision that would forever alter the course of our lives. We left behind the familiar comfort of city life, with its predictable rhythms and well-lit streets, for a place that existed in the spaces between civilization and wilderness, a tiny hamlet called Pine Grove, hidden within the ancient forests of northeastern Pennsylvania. Pine Grove wasn't just remote, it was a place where history had settled like sediment in still water. The woods surrounding our new home held centuries of Native American history, their stories etched into the landscape like invisible script. You could feel it in the way the wind moved through the trees, in the unexplained sounds that echoed through the valleys at twilight, in the way shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. By August, we had settled into something resembling normalcy. The strangeness of our new environment had become familiar, though never entirely comfortable. The dense forest that pressed against our property line felt less like nature and more like an entity unto itself, watching, waiting, perhaps even thinking in ways we couldn't understand. On the night that everything changed, I was alone in my bedroom, finding comfort in the artificial glow of the television. The clock had crept somewhere between 9 and 10, that liminal time when night hasn't fully claimed the world, but day has long since surrendered. The house had settled into that peculiar quietude that old buildings achieve after dark, when even the creaks and groans of settling wood seem to hold meaning. The first tap against my window was so faint I nearly convinced myself I'd imagined it. But the second tap, and then the third, carried an intentionality that couldn't be dismissed. Each sound seemed precisely spaced, as if whatever was causing them was counting the seconds between impacts. This wasn't the random percussion of a branch against glass or the scrabbling of small animals. This was communication. Terror and curiosity warred within me as I approached the window. The blinds, usually a barrier against the darkness outside, now felt like a flimsy shield between me and something that waited with terrible patience. My hands trembled as I reached for the cord, every childhood instinct screaming at me to run, to hide, to call for my parents. But something stronger than fear drew me forward, perhaps the same impulse that once drove our ancestors to look into the darkness beyond their cave mouths. What I saw in that moment has carved itself into my memory with the permanence of a scar. As I lifted the blinds, my young mind struggled to process what lay beyond the glass. Two eyes hung in the darkness, not the reflective eyes of a nocturnal animal or the warm glow of distant lights, but something that defied natural explanation. They burned with an internal luminescence that seemed to consume rather than emit light, like twin black holes rimmed with phosphorescent fire. The malevolence in those eyes was palpable, a conscious, calculating intelligence that went beyond mere animal predation. They conveyed an awareness that felt ancient and utterly alien, as if something from the depths of prehistoric memory had surfaced in our modern world. The height at which they floated was all wrong, far too elevated for any normal creature, suspended at a level that would have put them well into the canopy of the surrounding trees. My reaction was pure instinct, a primal response to encountering something that simply shouldn't exist. I slammed the blinds shut with such force that the whole fixture rattled, my fingers fumbling with the cord in desperate haste. The thin vinyl that had seemed so inadequate moments before now represented my only barrier against whatever waited outside. The living room became my sanctuary that night, though sanctuary might be too strong a word for a place where every shadow held potential menace. I huddled on the couch, wrapping myself in a blanket as if its familiar texture could somehow protect me from the unknown. Sleep was impossible. Even closing my eyes felt dangerous, as if breaking visual contact with my surroundings might somehow invite that presence inside. The hours until dawn stretched like taffy, each minute extending into what felt like hours. The normal nighttime sounds of our rural home, the settling of boards, the whisper of wind through trees, the distant calls of nocturnal animals, took on new and sinister meanings. Every creak could be footsteps. Every shadow could hide those terrible eyes. Morning brought the peculiar courage that daylight tends to inspire. Over breakfast, I tried to explain to my mother what I'd seen. Her response was predictable, the logical assumptions of an adult mind trying to impose order on chaos. She suggested it must have been the neighbor's cat, probably prowling for mice or birds. Her smile was gentle, understanding, completely missing the terror that still coursed through my veins. But I knew, with the unshakable certainty that sometimes comes to children, that this had been no ordinary animal. The height alone made that impossible. The eyes had been level with my second-story window, suspended in space at a height that would have put them nearly 20 feet above the ground. No cat, no matter how ambitious, could have achieved such elevation, even accounting for the nearby trees. What my mother couldn't understand, what my 11-year-old mind was only beginning to grasp, was that some things in this world exist beyond the comfortable explanations we create to help us sleep at night. The forests of northeastern Pennsylvania hold secrets far older than European settlement, stories that the original inhabitants knew well enough to pass down through generations as warnings. Years would pass before I began to piece together what I had encountered that night. It started with research into local folklore, then expanded into deeper studies of Native American legends about shape-shifting entities. The term Skinwalker kept surfacing in my research, though I learned that many tribes had their own names for similar creatures, beings that could take on animal forms but never quite perfectly, always retaining some element that gave away their true nature to the observant. The more I learned, the more certain details from that night took on new significance. The precise, deliberate nature of the tapping, not random like an animal's movements, but rhythmic, almost like communication. The way the eyes had seemed to study me with an intelligence that went beyond predatory interest. The height at which they appeared, as if whatever bore them either couldn't or wouldn't bother to maintain a completely convincing animal form. That encounter marked the end of a certain kind of innocence. It's one thing to believe in monsters as a child, to fear the shadows under your bed or the darkness in your closet. It's something else entirely to look into the night and have the night look back with eyes that hold ancient malice. Some knowledge changes you forever, alters the way you see the world and your place in it. What I saw that night continues to haunt the edges of my consciousness, surfacing in dreams and quiet moments when my guard is down. The memory of those eyes, burning with their impossible light, serves as a reminder that the world is far stranger and more dangerous than our modern minds want to accept. We build our houses, string up our electric lights, and tell ourselves we've conquered the darkness. But sometimes, in places where old forests press close and ancient stories still whisper on the wind, the darkness reminds us that we are not as far removed from our primitive past as we'd like to believe. In the decades since that night in Pine Grove, I've encountered many explanations for what I might have seen. Rational minds have suggested everything from owls to atmospheric phenomena, to the overactive imagination of a lonely child in a new home. But none of these explanations account for the profound sense of wrongness that accompanied those eyes, or the intelligence they conveyed, an intelligence that seemed to recognize me not just as prey, but as a witness to something I wasn't meant to see. The experience changed how I interact with darkness. Even now, living in a city with its constant artificial illumination, I find myself hesitating before looking out windows after nightfall. There's always that moment of tension, that primal fear, that I might once again find those eyes floating in the darkness, watching with that same ancient malevolence. What makes the Skinwalker theory particularly compelling isn't just the physical description, though the height and the eyes certainly match many traditional accounts. It's the purposefulness of the encounter. Whatever visited my window that night wasn't simply passing by. It had chosen that moment, that window, that child. The deliberate tapping, the patient waiting, these suggest an intelligence with intent, not the random wanderings of a natural creature. The forests of northeastern Pennsylvania still hold their secrets. The old stories haven't died. They've just gone quiet, waiting for moments when the modern world's certainties crack enough to let older truths slip through. Sometimes, late at night when the wind moves through trees in a certain way, I remember those eyes and wonder if somewhere in the dark spaces between civilized places, they're remembering me too. Local tribal elders speak of entities that have walked these lands since before human settlement, beings that view our brief human lives with a mixture of curiosity and malice. They warn that sometimes these creatures are drawn to the innocence of children, perhaps because young minds are more open to seeing things as they truly are, unfiltered by adult rationalization. That summer night in 2002 marked my first encounter with something that existed beyond the boundaries of what I'd been taught was possible. It wouldn't be my last brush with the unexplained, but it remains the clearest, the most undeniable. Those eyes, burning with their impossible light, opened a door in my understanding of the world that can never fully close. The neighbor's cat, indeed. Some things can't be explained away. Some experiences can't be rationalized into comfortable boxes. The truth is out there in the darkness, watching with ancient eyes, waiting for those moments when we look up at exactly the wrong time and see something that changes us forever. On July 3, 2020, the line between normal and nightmare blurred in ways I'm still trying to understand. I was 19 then, living in a rural area on the East Coast where forests and swampland created a natural maze around our house. That night was supposed to be simple, just a pre-4th of July celebration at a friend's house. Instead, it became my introduction to something that exists in the spaces between shadow and substance. The evening started innocently enough. After dinner around 9:30, I prepared for the short bike ride to my friend's house. The mundane details stand out in my memory now, throwing on flip-flops, grabbing a flashlight, unhooking my bike from its chain. These normal actions feel significant in retrospect, like the last moments of innocence before everything changed. The road to my friend's house wound through a corridor of trees so dense their branches formed a natural tunnel overhead. Even in daylight, this stretch of road had an oppressive quality. At night, it became something else entirely, a throat of darkness that swallowed both sound and light. With my flashlight beam creating a narrow path ahead and one hand on the handlebars, I set out into the gathering dark. The whispers started so subtly I almost convinced myself I was imagining them. At first, they were like background noise, the kind of sound you might attribute to wind and leaves or your own breathing. But they grew more distinct with each turn of my bike's wheels, multiplying and surrounding me like invisible spectators. The voices seemed to come from everywhere at once, left, right, behind, above, yet I couldn't make out a single word they were saying. Then came the scream. It wasn't the kind of scream you might hear at a carnival haunted house or in a horror movie. This was primal, raw, the sound of genuine terror or agony echoing through the trees. It reminded me of descriptions I'd read of mountain lion cries, how they sometimes sound disturbingly human, but this was different. This scream carried intent, purpose, and most terrifyingly, it was getting closer. As if the scream wasn't enough to turn my blood to ice, another sound joined the nightmarish chorus. Laughter. Not the warm laughter of friendship or even the mocking laughter of bullies, but something that existed outside the spectrum of normal human emotion. It was the kind of laugh that suggests its owner has never known joy only the cruel simulation of it. The sound seemed to chase me, getting closer with each rotation of my pedals. My legs burned with effort as I pushed harder, trying to outrace whatever was pursuing me through the darkness. The cramping in my muscles felt distant, unimportant compared to the primal need to escape. The road ahead seemed to stretch and distort, as if the very geography of the place was conspiring against me. What should have been a familiar path now felt endless, each bend in the road revealing only more darkness. When I saw a car's headlights in the distance, the brief flash of civilization through the trees, I nearly cried with relief. I pushed toward it like a drowning person swimming for shore, but just as I thought I might be reaching safety, everything changed. The whisper came again, but this time it was different. This wasn't the indistinct murmuring from before. This was clear, precise, and terrifyingly close. I felt cold breath against my ear, like winter itself was forming words. Protect your shadow. The phrase seemed to freeze the air around me, carrying weight and meaning I couldn't yet understand. When I finally arrived at my friend's house, having made the journey in record time, I tried to shake off the experience. The normal chaos of a pre-holiday celebration, fireworks, laughter, the smell of smoke and gunpowder, should have been enough to ground me back in reality. Instead, it became the backdrop for something even stranger. The incident between my friend and his younger brother seemed minor at first, the kind of scuffle siblings often have. But when their father's hand connected with my friend's face, something shifted in the fabric of reality. The snap of fingers by my ear was like a signal, a cue in some cosmic performance I hadn't known I was part of. The whispered words that followed turned my blood to ice. The shadow is now ours. Thank you for the treasure. In that moment, I realized I was witnessing something beyond normal sibling rivalry or family discipline. Something had been waiting for this moment, this exact configuration of events. The violence, minor as it was, had created an opening, and whatever had been following me through the dark had seized its opportunity. As the night progressed, reality began to unravel like a poorly sewn garment. The sounds came first, a whipping noise that seemed to slice through the air, followed by an ominous cracking from the woods. When I turned toward the farm pasture, illuminated by the full moon's unforgiving light, I saw it for the first time. The entity that emerged from the tree line defied natural law. It was more absence than presence, a void in the shape of something almost human. But its movement, that terrible, fluid motion as it raced toward me, belonged to no earthly creature. I fell back into my chair near the fire, a primal part of my brain recognizing that light and warmth might be my only defense against what approached. The thing stopped directly in front of me, close enough that if it had been human, I would have felt its breath. Its eyes were the only distinct feature, twin points of crimson that seemed to burn with their own internal fire. They held me transfixed, these impossibly red orbs floating in a face made of gathered darkness. The dread that washed over me was physical, like being submerged in ice water. Nobody else around the fire seemed to notice my terror, or the impossible thing standing before me. They continued their conversations and laughter, oblivious to the horror unfolding mere feet away. I wanted desperately to alert them, to ask if they could see what I was seeing, but fear of being labeled insane kept me silent. In that moment of paralysis, it spoke again, "Follow the shadows." The barn beckoned like a mouth of darkness. When I made my excuse about needing the bathroom, my voice sounded strange and distant to my own ears. Each step toward the barn felt like moving through deep water, as if reality itself was becoming thicker, more resistant to movement. The pig's squeal as I entered seemed like a warning, a recognition of the wrongness that had followed me inside. The thing that crouched on the beam above me moved like a nightmare given form. Its Spider-Man-like posture was a cruel parody of human movement, as if it had learned about bodies by watching shadows on walls rather than actual people. When it dropped down before me, the absolute silence of its landing was more terrifying than any sound could have been. The impact should have echoed through the barn. Instead, it was as if the thing absorbed all sound, all light, all normalcy. When it extended its hand toward me, what I saw defied comprehension. There, floating above its palm like a twisted puppet, was a perfect miniature version of my friend rendered in pure darkness. His shadow, somehow extracted and condensed into three-dimensional form. The sight of it violated everything I understood about reality, about the fundamental laws that governed our world. The creature's face transformed as I watched, features emerging from the void like a sculpture being carved from absolute darkness. Its yellow teeth gleamed with an impossible light, as if they were catching and reflecting illumination that didn't exist. The smile it gave me was knowing, almost conspiratorial, as if we were now sharing some terrible secret. As it handed me the shadow figure, the barn around us became unstable, reality flickering like a faulty fluorescent light. The darkness seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, and the laughter that echoed through the space came from everywhere and nowhere at once. I clutched the small shadow form, its substance feeling both solid and impossibly insubstantial, like holding smoke that had somehow been frozen. The strobe-like effect that followed turned the barn into a nightmare carousel of frozen moments. With each flash, the entity moved closer, its movement not fluid but rather a series of impossible positions, like a film missing crucial frames. When it reached me, its arctic breath felt like a violation, as if winter itself was trying to crawl inside my body through any opening it could find. The truck ride home became a surreal journey shared with something that shouldn't exist. The shadow sat across from me, its presence both undeniable and impossible. Its gesture for silence felt less like a threat and more like a promise, a pact between us that what had transpired would remain our secret. The headache that pounded through my skull seemed to pulse in rhythm with the entity's very existence. That final visit in my bedroom, where it perched on the edge of my bed like some twisted guardian angel, cemented the reality of what had occurred. Its warning about keeping my friend's shadow safe carried weight beyond the words themselves. It wasn't just a threat, it was an initiation into a world where shadows had substance and darkness had consciousness. The shadow figure still exists, hidden away somewhere in my room like a dark secret waiting to be rediscovered. Sometimes, late at night, I can feel its presence even when I can't see it. A weight in the darkness, a reminder that reality is far more fluid than we pretend. The statue isn't just an object, it's a tether to something beyond normal understanding, a proof that what happened that night wasn't just imagination or stress or the product of an overactive mind. Looking back now, I realize that every element of that night seems orchestrated, as if the entire evening was a carefully arranged series of events leading to that crucial moment. The bike ride through the darkness, the whispers that grew in intensity, the violence between brothers, all of it feels connected in ways I'm only beginning to understand. The entity didn't just happen to be there, it was waiting. Perhaps had been waiting long before I ever got on my bike that evening. The most unsettling aspect isn't the creature itself, though its image still haunts my dreams. It's the realization that this thing, whatever it was, operates according to rules and purposes we can't comprehend. It wasn't simply trying to terrify me, it was conducting a transaction of sorts, using me as an unwitting participant in some larger design. The shadow it gave me wasn't just a token or a trophy, it was a responsibility, a burden, perhaps even a test. I've never told my friend about his shadow, about how some part of him now resides in a dark corner of my room. How could I explain that his moment of family conflict somehow created an opening for something ancient and other to reach in and extract a piece of his essence? The weight of this knowledge sits heavy, a constant reminder that the world we think we know is just a thin veneer over something far stranger and more terrible. The entity hasn't returned since that night, but its absence doesn't feel like an ending. Rather, it feels like a pause, as if I'm now living in the space between movements in some vast, incomprehensible symphony. The shadow statue serves as both proof and warning, proof that what I experienced was real, and warning that reality is far more fragile and permeable than we like to believe. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my room late at night, I find myself fighting the urge to search for the shadow figure. Part of me wants to verify its existence, to reassure myself that I haven't imagined the whole experience. But a deeper, wiser part knows that some things are better left undisturbed. The entity trusted me with this piece of shadow for a reason, and until I understand what that reason is, perhaps it's best to let it rest in darkness. What I encountered that night, demon, spirit, or something else entirely, seemed to exist at the intersection of mischief and malevolence. It was playing games, yes, but games with rules and consequences I couldn't begin to fathom. The fact that it chose to interact with me, to involve me in its mysterious purposes, suggests that there's more to this story than I yet understand. The unknown truly is unknown, as vast and dark as the shadows that entity commanded. We build our lives on the assumption that we understand the rules of reality, that we know where the boundaries lie. But sometimes, on nights when the moon is full and the shadows seem to move of their own accord, I remember those burning red eyes and yellow teeth, and I wonder how many other ancient things are watching us, waiting for just the right moment to reach out and collect what they consider theirs.